Chronicles of the War of Souls Book Series. Book 1 Valeria, The Beginning of the End. Chapter 12. The Iron Shaman. The warband moved south with extreme, calculated caution, absorbing every rustle of the dry steppe, every suspicious crack of a twig under crude soles, every distant, unfamiliar cry of a bird of prey. The air was clear and cruel, smelling of dust, wormwood, and the distant smoke of alien campfires. Barzog, though driven by an inexorable inner call pulsing in his temples like a second alarm beat of a heart, had not lost his warrior's judgment, forged in dozens of bloody skirmishes and night raids. This judgment was cold and heavy as a whetstone in his chest, and it forced him to notice what eluded others: the slightest movement of mound grass against the wind, the strange silence in a thicket of woodland where suddenly all sound ceased. Ahead, on the flanks, and behind the small, tightly knit column, scouts glided soundlessly as shadows, the most agile and keen-eyed of the warriors. Their eyes, narrowed against the wind and perpetual tension, seemed to see through the dense grass and pre-dawn mist, while their ears, covered in rough, cracked skin, caught even the almost inaudible rustle of a snake sliding through the dust. Their task was clear and simple: to prevent a sudden, disastrous encounter. Lands of hostile clans, marked by crude totem poles in which yellow teeth and black feathers were embedded, and fresh, deep tracks of alien wargs could lie on their uncharted path. One mistake, one sound made at the wrong time, could cost them all their lives. They followed untrodden, forgotten paths, winding along the bottoms of dry, cracked riverbeds where cold clay crunched underfoot, avoiding open, wine-scoured expanses. There, their silhouettes, etched against the pale sky, could betray them to an enemy from a distance of many arrow flights. They hid in deep, dark ravines that smelled of dampness and rotting roots, and in sparse woodlands of stunted, twisted trees, as if cramped by eternal, mute pain. Each evening, as the sun sank below the horizon, staining the sky the crimson of congealed blood and merging lawn shadows into a solid, blue blackness, Barzog personally, trusting no one, would inspect the temporary camp. He checked that they were well hidden under overhanging, gloomy cliffs or in thick, thorny thickets, that the smoke from their meager, barely smoldering fire, kindled only to keep the fingers gripping weapons from stiffening, was not visible. The warriors, sitting by the fire whose flame tongues licked blackened stones, understood with their entire being that they walked on foreign, hostile land. Their faces, lit by the flickering, uneven light, were strained to the limit, and calloused hands, etched with white scars, never left the hafts of axes or the shafts of short, heavy spears. Even the wargs that accompanied them, usually so noisy and quick-tempered, moved with ears flattened and heavy-browed heads lowered, emitting no familiar roar or whine. They submitted to the grim necessity of remaining invisible and inaudible, like spirits of the night. And all the while, the hum did not recede but grew with each day, transforming from background noise into an obsessive, imperious melody sounding for him alone, in the very bone-deep depths of his skull. For Barzog, it was now like the beats of a huge, subterranean heart, its measured, relentless rhythm marking each of his steps, each beat of his own heart, merging with them into one. It guided them unerringly, like the needle of an enchanted compass, pointing the only true direction through monotonous, wearyingly endless expanses where one hill was indistinguishable from another, and one dry, dusty river valley from the next. Sometimes, usually at dawn when the sky was just lightening into cold, watery hues, the call would weaken, becoming barely perceptible, a hissing whisper as if retreating into the earth. Then Barzog would involuntarily slow his pace, and his face, usually impassive, would darken with a thick shadow of doubt and silent, gnawing irritation, as if he had been deprived of hearing or a part of his flesh. But soon, as if gathering strength with the sunrise and the first ray gilded the tops of distant hills, the hum would return, even more distinct and demanding. It was like a painful, red-hot thread stretched from the very center of his being, from that dark place beneath his ribs where rage and fury were born, far away to the south. And this forced the chieftain to quicken his step again, leading the tired, dust-covered band forward with a new, almost desperate fury, where caution had no place, only a blind need to reach the goal. To finish this journey, they passed lands where on hilltops stood the totem poles of alien tribes, ugly idols with inlays of yellow teeth and black feathers, saw in the distance thin, gray columns of smoke rising from unfamiliar, hostile settlements. The wind sometimes carried to them alien smells of alien campfires and alien, unfamiliar food, sickly sweet, rancid, nauseating. Scouts returned with brief reports of silhouettes spotted far away on hill crests, of fresh tracks of alien wargs, larger ones, imprinted on soft earth near dried-up streams. Then the entire band would freeze in hiding, holding their breath, becoming part of the landscape, a stone, a bush, a shadow. They let the potential danger pass, like a pack of experienced, hungry wolves letting an unfamiliar, but too strong and dangerous beast go by, harboring in their hearts not fear, but cold, deferred rage. With each day, the journey became harder, sapping the last of their strength. To familiar, yet already alien step gradually, almost imperceptibly, gave way to hilly, rocky foothills. The ground underfoot grew harder, littered with sharp gravel that dug even into the tough leather of their soles. The air grew drier, thinner, colder at night, searing the lungs like an icy needle. Breathing became difficult, short, frequent gasps tearing at their chests. And even the hardy wargs began to wheeze heavily, laboring, slipping and sending stones clattering as they climbed steep, crumbling slopes overgrown with sickly, thorny shrubs. But Barzog, guided by his inner compass, whose invisible needle burned him from within like red-hot iron pressed to fresh meat, neither turned aside nor slowed. He walked inexorably forward, his massive, mighty figure coated in road dust, like a solitary dark rock sailing against the current of time and fatigue. And his 100 loyal warriors followed him relentlessly, obeying the blind, animal will of their chieftain, in whose burning, yellow eyes like deep sulfur pits they saw the reflection of something ancient, inexplicable, and inexorable, calling them ever onward to the south, into the very heart of a growing, oppressive unknown, where known roads ended, and something nameless began. As they advanced, dark, vague outlines slowly took shape before them. They grew from the very quivering haze of the horizon, like mirages given flesh from stone and shadow. At first, they were merely blur, indistinct black dots, stains on the faded canvas of the sky. But with each step, with each short, tense breath, they acquired ever clearer, more sinister forms, looming grim and unyielding. Before them, rising straight from the stony, barren soil like the bones of an ancient giant piercing the earth's burial shroud, towered huge boulders, blackened by time and weather. They were riddled with wide, deep hollows, like wounds that do not bleed but only yawn with mute, stony emptiness. Like the empty eye sockets of a gigantic skull, they watched the approaching orcs with their dark, bottomless maws, and the cold wind that wandered among them emitted a low, mournful howl, like a groan. Caves, and that inner compass which had relentlessly hammered in his temples all these long days and nights, that force which had driven him through the steppes and foothills like a whip, now pointed directly, unambiguously, and imperiously to the largest and gloomiest of these stone openings. It gaped black in the center of the jumbled rocks, which resembled a petrified herd of monsters, like a gateway to another, subterranean world where no living foot had trod, only shadows and cold. This was the entrance, not just a hole in the rock, but a threshold dividing to worlds, the familiar, harsh world of the steppe with its wind, smells of wormwood and stars, and what lay beyond it. In the darkness, where different laws and a different silence reigned, Barzog halted, and the warriors behind him stopped too, as if colliding with an invisible, insurmountable barrier, a cold breath emanating from the stone. He stood, his gaze fixed on the black, bottomless chasm, and the hum in his skull that had tormented him all these days with its heavy, insistent beating suddenly transformed into a deafening, triumphant roar, filling his entire being, an absolute and final command against which there was no argument. All this long, exhausting journey, all the days of doubt and nights of anxiety, when he woke in a cold sweat from the silent call, had led him here to this stone threshold, beyond which awaited something for which he had left everything. The tents of his clan, the smell of smoke from his home hearths, the simple, clear life of a chieftain where the enemy was visible to the eye, not felt in the depths of the skull. Staring into the blind, yawning eye socket of the cliff, he understood with cold, merciless clarity. Now he must enter. For him, there was no road back to the steppe, to his clan, to his former life. This understanding was not fear, it was heavy as lead, and final as the descending axe of an executioner. He slowly drew his weapon, and his massive figure, blotting out the dull daylight for an instant, crossed the stone threshold and dissolved into the darkness. The huge two-handed axe in his hand was a familiar, almost living weight, casting a hideous, wavering shadow on the rough, uneven wall. A shadow that writhed and slid over the rock's protrusions and fissures like a separate, sinister entity following at his heels. He needed no torch. His narrow, predatory eyes, accustomed to the perpetual gloom of tense and long night marches across starless steppe, drank in the meager light that seeped timidly, reluctantly from outside. Behind him a pale strip at the entrance, those eyes, burning with a yellow fire under his heavy, overhanging brow, slowly, with predatory, precise thoroughness, scanned the entrance area of the grotto. His gaze searched every ledge, every dark, enticing fissure where not even a glimmer reached, for hidden threat or that very long-awaited sign that had led him here, making his heart beat faster and his fingers tighten on his weapon. The muffled, as if from another world, murmur of his Orcs' voices and the impatient, abrupt snarls of wargs reached him from outside, and this familiar, habitual noise provided a faint comfort, reminding him they had not gone anywhere. They had cordoned in the base of the cliff. They awaited his return or his command. They were the last living thread, thin but strong, connecting him to his former life, to the sun and wind. He drew air into his nostrils, heavy and stale, smelling of ancient, time-worn stone, damp, wet clay, and something else, something ancient, inert, and utterly alien, sweetish and decayed. Like the scent of a long-forgotten tomb, the chieftain ran his broad, scarred and calloused palm over the cold, rough wall, feeling under his coarse, sandpaper-like skin a barely perceptible, but inexorable vibration, the very one that had guided him here all these days. It was like a taut rope tied to his very heart, and now, in the cave's silence, its tremor felt clearer, more resonant. He was not here as a scout cautiously checking a new shelter for the scent of water, or signs of beasts. He was the one being led, both quarry and hunter in one. And this duality, this strange mingling of roles echoed within him as a strange, uneasy reverberation, as if deep within his being two voices argued with each other, yet both sounded in unison with the hum in his head. Without looking back, with a confidence that had festered and grown in his chest like an abscess all these long weeks, he moved deeper, toward the growing, almost tangible gloom. The darkness slowly consumed the last, pitiful reflections of day, devouring the gray rectangle of the entrance, and soon he saw it only as a dim, distant memory of the world of the living. His own steps, heavy and measured, echoed hollowly in the stone belly, and this solitary, repeating sound, the dull thud of soles on stone, interrupted by the grit of sand, was the only thing violating the crushing, ringing silence of the underground. Soon, the tunnel before him low, constricting, forcing him to bend, split in two, diverging into black, gaping chasms vanishing into the unknown in different directions, like the forked tongue of a giant serpent. He did not slow his pace, showed not a shadow of doubt or hesitation, turning into the left branch, for it was from there, curling along the walls in strange, deathly highlights, that the same cold, unearthly light streamed forth, the light that had beckoned and called him all this time, the light he had seen with his inner vision, in his dreams, and, when awake with closed eyes, the cave suddenly yawned before him, transforming into a vast, high-ceilinged grotto whose vaults were lost somewhere in the heights, in a swirling, shimmering veil of cold, phosphorescent light, like the glow of rotting trees in a deep forest, yet devoid of life. This light had no visible source. It emanated from the very walls and ceiling, as if the stone was saturated through with a ghostly, lunar radiance, having absorbed it over long, mute centuries, and now slowly, reluctantly releasing it back into the eternal darkness, like a dying man yielding his last breath. The stone here was not simply smoothed by time and water. It seemed polished by an unknown, mighty force, polished to a mirror-like, sterile gleam, and emitted an even, lifeless, ghostly glow that held neither the warmth of living flame nor the comfort of a home hearth, only a deathly, indifferent luminescence that froze the blood, raised invisible gooseflesh, and made the very air seem thick and frigid. And in the very center of this unearthly grotto, where all the rays of this fantastic, unnatural light converged, sat an orc, motionless and silent as an ancient stone idol, forgotten here for entire epochs. His back was unnaturally straight, his head bowed, and his powerful, toil-worn hands with upturned palms resting on his knees seemed carved from the same shimmering, cold stone as the walls of this hall. "I have been waiting for you, Barzog of the Black Spear, chieftain of the Ash-Hide clan," a voice sounded, and it seemed as if the stone itself, the cave itself, eternity itself compressed within this underground hall, had spoken. The sound was not born in one place. It vibrated in the air, emanated from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound was low and deep, devoid of the familiar Orcish rasp and coarseness, those overtones of rage and pain known to every warrior. It was born not only from the throat of the being sitting before him, but from the very air. The shimmering walls, the ancient, silent rock holding the memory of millennia. In this voice was the whisper of crumbling centuries-old dust and the mute, oppressive weight of bygone epochs. The roar of dried-up seas and the crack of sundering continents. The creature raised its head with a slow, fluid motion devoid of muscular effort, as if lifted by an invisible hand. And Barzog saw a face distantly resembling those of his kin, the same coarse, angular features, massive tusks protruding from the gums, tough, cracked skin like parched earth. But its eyes were like to shards of the coldest night sky, studded with tiny, icy, and lifeless stars that did not shine but merely marked the depth of emptiness. In them was none of the familiar fury, hatred, nor even the concept of life, warmth, or emotion, only infinite, all-consuming void in which time itself vanished without a trace. And the gaze fixed upon him seemed the gaze of eternity itself, indifferent and inexorable. This was not a warrior to be defeated, in honest combat, by shattering his steel with one's own, by blade and strength. No, this was something else, something against which brute might and fury which had served Barzog as reliable currency for centuries proved empty, pathetic gestures, like attempting to stop an avalanche with a wave of the hand. Its armor resembled congealed, living darkness, only vaguely echoing the outlines of Orcish plate, a hint of pauldrons. A breastplate but devoid of its weight, ringing materiality and protection. They were not forged, they simply were shimmering and undulating like smoke over a long-dead fire, sometimes dissolving into a transparent, wavering haze through which the wall's outline could be guessed, then regaining a vague, menacing shape, condensing into the semblance of solid plates for an instant, only to slip back into motion. The skin visible beneath on its hands and face seemed pale and translucent as ash from a fire extinguished so long ago that even the memory of its warmth and light, of the crackling logs and the dance of flame tongues, was forever lost, erased by the ages. Its features, preserving Orcish severity and might, heavy jaw, prominent cheekbones, were frozen, as if carved from eternal, immobile stone in those immemorial times when the world was just being born from primordial, boiling chaos and knew neither pain nor joy. And from the entire being, from each of its motionless particles, from the very air round it, emanated such an all-consuming, mute antiquity that breath caught in the chest, becoming short and cautious, not simply a long life stretched over millennia, but genuine, silent eternity, cold and indifferent to the bustle of all that lives, to birth and death, to rage and hope. Barzog, mighty chieftain, accustomed to the wild chaos of skirmishes, the salty taste of fresh blood on his lips, the victorious roar tearing from his own throat, stood before it, suddenly feeling insignificant and ephemeral. He was like a dust mote raised by the steppe wind, about to be swept into oblivion, leaving neither trace nor memory. His own body, sweaty, coated in a layer of road dust and spatters of dried grime, now seemed to him incredibly crude, temporary, almost shameful in its tangibility, a pathetic shell of flesh and bone that could be damaged, wounded, destroyed. The hand gripping the familiar, worn haft of the battle-tested axe, the hand that knew the weight of death and the resilience of living flesh beneath the blade, of its own accord, against his will, against all warrior instincts, lowered. The heavy blade, so recently an extension of his fury, touched the shimmering, cold floor with a dull, submissive thud, like a groan. Slowly, almost unconsciously, driven by a vague impulse whether to touch the unfathomable or to prove its reality to himself, he stretched forth his calloused, white-scarred palm, but his fingers froze in the icy air, not daring to close the last few inches, afraid to desecrate this frozen embodiment of eternity, or, worse, to be consumed by it, to dissolve in this indifference like a drop of water in the sea. An unfamiliar, soul-crushing fear locked his muscles, made them weak and disobedient, not the fear of death in battle, which he knew and even cherished, but a different, deep, and ancient horror. Horror born of the very encounter with something incomprehensible that had existed here, in this stone womb, long before he was born, and would coldly, with not the slightest interest, behold the world long after his bones had rotted in the earth. "Who are you?" Barzog exhaled, and his own, always imperious and loud, cutting voice sounded alien, muffled, and weak in this vast, sound-absorbing hall. It was as if the stone walls, greedily drinking the light, drank in every sound as well, not letting it be born truly, to make the air its own, to force the world to hear. He did not take his burning, yellow, sulfur flame eyes off the being, absorbing even the smallest detail of its phantom appearance, the undulating, uncertain shadow armor, the pale, ashen skin on its finger joints, those very bottomless eyes holding nothing but the icy, absolute calm of eternity, a calm more terrible than any fury. The creature slowly, with unnatural fluidity, as if moved not by muscles, but by the slowest thought, inclined its head, and its answer came not as a sound striking the eardrums from without, but as knowledge born in the very depths of Barzog's soul, in those hidden, dark corners of consciousness he had not suspected, where his instincts slept. I am one of the ancients. I am Manimus. It paused, and the shimmering, phosphorescent light around it, this cold reflection of the stone, seemed to waver in time with its soundless words, growing momentarily brighter, denser. It filled the cave with a cold, lifeless, almost physically oppressive radiance, from which bizarre, twisted, unnaturally long shadows danced on the smooth, time-polished walls. They seemed alive and sentient, independent entities observing from a world of shadows. The air grew thicker, heavier, difficult to breathe, saturated with the sharp, clean smell of ozone, as after a close thunderstorm, and the dust of ancient, untouched, pristine stone. It seemed the cave itself, this stone womb of the world, held its breath in tense, ominous anticipation of what would follow. But my tale would be too long for your mortal hearing. Full of the nose of fleeting life and momentary passions, the same voice sounded again, and each sound, minted and heavy, fell into the ringing, taut as a bowstring silence, like a stone into a bottomless, dark well. Its echo spread not in the ears, causing a physical reverberation, but in consciousness itself, birthing understanding directly into thought, bypassing hearing. Let me show you instead. And before Barzog could say anything, protest this intrusion, or simply react by clenching his fist, the familiar world around him exploded, losing all solidity and support. The glowing, cold walls of the cave swirled, dissolved like night fire smoke borne away by a sudden gust of wind. They carried away with them the last sensation of reality, the familiar, comforting roughness of stone underfoot, the smell of wet clay and old, damp moss, even the feeling of his own weight. He was seized by an all-consuming, paralyzing sensation of rapid, soundless falling into a void, as if he had plunged into the deepest abyss. Only this abyss was not of water pressing on the chest and flooding the lungs, but of time and memory itself, where past, present, and future, all his own memories and dreams, intertwined into a single, incomprehensible, and painful tangle, tearing consciousness apart. He floated, did not fall, but floated in an airless, blind, and deaf void where there was no up or down, no light or dark, and in this primordial, absolute silence, louder than any thunder, whole worlds collided and were born right before his eyes. They flashed with dazzling, mute bursts of blue, white, and crimson light and died out like sparks in a smithy's forge, living a moment equal to eternity. Before his inner vision, seared onto the very fabric of reality, passed, replacing each other with terrifying speed, images of incomprehensible, antediluvian power, from which blood froze in the veins and the mind, desperately clinging to familiar, pathetic concepts: forest, river, tribesman, enemy hopelessly seized up, refusing to comprehend. He saw how from the seething, still unformed, blind chaos, from sheer formless, purposeless fury, 12 spirit elementals crystallized into being, fierce, blind, and mighty essences of fire, water, earth, air, nature, metal, light, matter, time, darkness, soul, and chaos itself. They raged in the great, primordial, starless dark, knowing neither form nor purpose, aware of neither self nor other. Their battle was eternal, without beginning or end, meaningless and yet grand, for it was the very essence of existence in that moment. They devoured each other in endless, insatiable fury, and the roar of bursting star bodies, born and perishing in an instant, mingled in his perception with the quiet, barely audible, first breath-like whisper of only just born, obedient matter, with the first, timid, uncertain beat of an as yet uncreated but already felt heart. Then, cutting through this formless, furious chaos like a blade through water, they appear, the gods, beings whose true, profound nature was incomprehensible to a mind bound by flesh and bone, sight and hearing. They were light and thought, will and law in one, and they offered these blind, furious, wild elementals the greatest gift and the heaviest, unbearable burden for some, to gain form, to cease the meaningless, eternal war and become wardens, guardians and pillars, whose combined mighty wills would raise the vault of heaven, establish the unshakable foundation of earth, and draw the boundary between light and dark, order and chaos, as reward to become the first, eternal, undying runes in the book of being, stars on the firmament, whose cold, constant light would guide and protect all living things to come. Barzog, witnessing this, felt with his entire being how some spirits, taming their wild, untamed, free nature, bowing it before a greater will, accepted this gift. They clothed themselves in new, beautiful and terrible, majestic forms: Ignis, blazing and creative Nerea, deep and changeable Geum, immovable and patient Dryad, flowering and inexorable, and others whose names he could not hold, while others, prouder in their freedom or more savage in their frenzy, rejected it with a fury that shook the foundations of the young cosmos, wishing to preserve their primordial, unrestricted will, their right to be chaos. And then the vision changed sharply and painfully, as if he were violently torn from one reality where he was but a passive spectator, and hurled into another, even more frightening, more personal, more familiar alien. Barzog saw cracks, first thin as a spider's web, almost invisible to the naked eye, but clear as scars on a face to his current sight. They slowly, inexorably spread across the surface of the monumental, inner light-shining great codex in Almarian, that symbol of law and order. He saw the savagely hacked, desecrated white-groven ancient, sacred place of power where once, in distant times, elves, dwarves, and men, such different peoples, had sealed an unbreakable alliance with oaths now trampled and covered in the dust of oblivion. And finally, as if the culmination of this mounting horror, the point into which everything converged, he saw Lender. He saw the white tree, the earthly embodiment of Dryad, the nature star, the living, breathing heart of the elven refuge, the source of their strength and wisdom. And from its very base, from those dark, secret places or mighty, serpent-thick roots plunged into the depths of the slumbering, ancient land, a thin, coal-black, vilely pulsing with a dull, deathly light crack crept up the milk-white, rune-etched trunk of age-old, quiet wisdom. It was alive, but with the life of disease, a festering, poison oozing wound on the very body of the world. And with each of its dull, repulsive pulse beats, coinciding with the convulsive, rapid beating of his own heart in this witnessed reality, something irreversible faded, something important and binding, some invisible thread holding the fabric of the cosmos intact, irreparably crumbled to dust in its very foundation. And in this one was freedom. This crack, this rotting, corrosing ulcer in the very body of creation, became the long-awaited freedom, an open door for those wardens who had initially, in the deepest essence of their primordial, unsubdued selves, resisted the will of the gods, whose hearts, vested with form by superior force and endowed with duty, had always harbored the seed of eternal rebellion, the thirst not to serve and guard, but to rule and reshape. For those who, in their blinding, all-consuming arrogance, desired to displace the old gods from their high, distant thrones and change the very foundations of the world order, subjecting them to their own, singular will, to pantheon, for centuries, millennia seemingly an unshakable rock, the pillar of all existence, cracked along all its seams, groaned under pressure from within, and the first to slip from under the weakened, confused, fragmented gaze of the gods, to seep through like black, acrid smoke through this bloody, agonizing tear in reality itself, was he Animus, master and keeper of souls, spinner of leads and ruthless gatherer of fates, he who knew the price of each and now came to claim his due. Barzog understood this with his entire being, with every particle of his simple, yet unyielding, steel-strong will, with a clarity that burned with its cold clarity, leaving no room for hope or illusions. The old world, the world of his fathers and grandfathers, the world of steppe laws, bloody grievances and simple joes by the fire, was dying, and its agony was both terrible in its death throes, and majestic in the scale of the collapsing celestial vault. The vision vanished as suddenly as it had appeared, cut off like a snapped string. It left behind only a bitter, lingering aftertaste of ash and decay on the tongue, in a mouth parched with horror, and a universal, crushing loneliness in the very soul, which suddenly realized itself a grain of sand in the desert of eternity. Barzog stood again in the shimmering, cold grotto, but now that shimmer seemed to him the light of a distant, dying star. His knees treacherously buckled, trembling, aching in the joints from the strain endured, and his mind, accustomed to simple and clear, tangible things, the ring of steel on steel, the coppery, warm smell of blood on the lips, the acrid, eye-stinging smoke of campfires struggled, overcoming numbness, as if groping through thick, impenetrable, icy fog, to return to the present. But this present would never be the same again. It was poisoned by knowledge, like a well poisoned by carrion. The hum in his head, that alarm beat, relentless companion that had haunted him all these long days and sleepless nights, finally fell silent. It yielded to a different torment, a deafening, absolute, crushing silence in which only his own, suddenly seeming so loud, heartbeat, and the bitter, wormwood tincture burning awareness of his own insignificance, the pettiness of his fate before the unfolding, like a scroll, destinies of a whole world, where he was not a warrior but merely a bug. He looked at Animus, one of those very ancients who first had taken advantage of the great collapse, the crack in the pantheon, to break free from his age-old, oppressive imprisonment, to cast off the fetters imposed by the gods like shedding worn clothes. And now he understood with piercing, agonizing clarity that he stood not simply before a mighty being, the strongest he had ever seen, one whom, gathering all clans, one might try to overwhelm with numbers and fury. No, he stood before a living shard of a bygone, unimaginably distant epoch, a witness to the very act of creation that had just flashed before his inner sight, before an essence whose will and design stretched further than he could ever imagine, beyond the horizon, beyond life and death, and who now, in this very hour of great turmoil and universal dissolution, was laying claim to its ancient, prison-forge, undeniable rights to this entire world, to every dust mote, every blade of grass, and every soul, including his own internecine wars over wells, his seemingly unshakable right to ancestral land, the cold step, his simple and cruel yet understandable law of might the strong take, the weak submit, all of it, in one moment, under the gaze of those starry eyes, turned to dust. Insignificant bustle, a childish, meaningless game in a sandbox against the backdrop of unfolding universal drama, where the stake was not the life of a clan, but the very life and death of the cosmos, the fabric of being. And in the deepest part of his soul, amidst the chaos of thoughts, the wreckage of his worldview, and the flood of contradictory feelings, fear, humiliation, suppressed rage, slowly but inexorably, like a sprout on a rock, a burning, hitherto unspoken question was born. With effort, feeling how heavy his head had become, he raised it, and his voice, hoarse from long silence and endured, mute horror, broke the ringing, almost tangible, glass-like silence of the cave. What role he began, and the words came with incredible difficulty, torn from his throat as if he were moving heavy, blood and sweat-drenched stones with his tongue. What role in this is meant for me, an orc with spear and axe, whose life is but dust swirling under the feet of beings like you? Why did you wait for me? Animus did not stir. Not a muscle twitched on its stony, frozen face, but the light around it, that cold, phosphorescent light of the cave, thickened, became almost tangible, dense as morning fog in a hollow, yet devoid of moisture and life. Its starry eyes, bottomless and cold as the interstellar void, bored into Barzog. This gaze penetrated deeper than skin and bone, past muscles and ribs, straight into the very soul, turning it inside out, laying bare before the orc himself all that he harbored, good and bad. It seemed time itself in the cave froze, stopped in tense, heavy expectation of an answer, and the walls, these eternal, mute sentinels absorbing the whisper of ages, listened to every uttered word, to every sigh. "You are a vessel," came the answer, and each syllable was minted not from air, but from eternity itself, cold, hard, and inexorable as a verdict. "A conduit, your will, your fury, and your crude, unhewn strength, contained within you like, or in stone, are capable of bearing the weight of my being, of not breaking under its pressure. Our natures, our essences are alike in the main. We are born to rule and command, to subject others to our will. You, like me, in your very core, in the depths of your being, are ready to change and subjugate the whole world, to remake it to your liking, to see it kneeling. Through you, as through open, willingly flung wide gates, I can regain my strength, to complete what was begun, to wipe from the face of the earth the decrepit, weakened, blind gods. You are not dust, orc. You are the one born for power, the one born to rule. I see it. I see in you the one who is not content with little." Barzog listened, unable to tear his gaze from those starry eyes, and a strange, Unnatural calm began to rise in him from the very souls, from the depths of his weary body. It was cold and heavy as a polished river boulder, smooth and inexorable. It slowly settled upon him, pressing down, crushing the last convulsive remnants of fear and confusion, burning them out like fire burns dry grass. He was not a pawn in another's game, a bargaining chip. He was a tool, a vessel, as the being had said, an important, chosen one. In his veins, under the coarse, rough, sun-darkened skin, in each powerful, rhythmic beat of his heart now beating more evenly lay a strength he had not suspected, a strength capable not merely of crushing an enemy, but of breaking the spine of the world order itself, of standing against the very foundations of being. This was not glory, not honor from the old, hoarse, smoky tales the Skalds told by the fire. This was something immeasurably greater, grandiose, staggering in scale, and something far more terrible and final, leaving no paths back. His fingers involuntarily clenched on empty air, feeling the familiar, comfortable, notch-scored roughness of an axe haft. And in this simple, habitual gesture lay his entire former essence, warrior and chieftain, an essence that now was to become part of something vast, frightening, and infinitely alluring in its power. Animus watched him unwaveringly, and in that soul-freezing, absolute emptiness of its eyes Barzog read a silent, yet thunderous as thunder in silence question, a question addressed not to his primitive, mundane reason, but to the most secret, animal, primordial essence of his soul, to that dark and furious thing lurking deeper than any fear of death, deeper than any battle rage. Was he ready? Ready to accept this burden, this infernal honor, this weight that would crush an ordinary orc? Was his people, wild and harsh as the very steppe that Boran nurtured him, ready to become part of something infinitely greater than their nomadic trails, their petty clan feuds, their short, cruel, simple, and so comprehensible life? Or would they vanish without a trace, as Wote, in this being's words, the humans mired in their chaos and trifles, and the elves withdrawn into themselves, proud and aloof, merely another forgotten, decayed, meaningless page in the dying book of being, over which the dark, cold waters of the great ocean of oblivion would close, leaving not even a memory? Barzog stood motionless, rooted, grown into the shimmering floor, feeling the weight of each breath in his broad, mighty, yet suddenly so vulnerable chest. The air in the cave seemed thick and viscous, as if filled with the finest, invisible particles of ancient stone dust stirred by the mere presence, the mere will of this incomprehensible being. His fingers, accustomed to gripping an axe haft until the knuckles whitened and cracked, now slid unconsciously, seeking some support in this floating world, over the cold, shimmering surface of the nearest wall, but they found only the wet roughness of stone covered with a thin, slippery, repellent film of age-old, unwanted moisture. And what his voice broke, he swallowed a lump in his throat. What must I do? Animus slowly, with the same majestic, frightening fluidity, raised a hand, and the phantom, cold light in the cave began to play with new, ominous, bluish-crimson hues, casting quivering, unnaturally twisted, as if convulsing in agony shadows on the walls. Its fingers, pale and almost transparent as ice, seemed carved from the same ancient, shimmering material as the walls of this underground sanctuary, as if they were not part of a body but an extension of the stone itself, its animated part. You must agree to let me in, it spoke, and the words hung in the heavy, stifling air, filled with an inescapable, iron heaviness, like stone blocks ready to fall. Willingly, to open the gates of your soul, to remove the bolts from your deepest recesses and accept my essence. Your flesh will become my raiment, your will my sword, your fury my shield. But remember, henceforth your heart will beat in unison with mine, and your thoughts, your desires, your dreams will become part of my great designs. You will feel what I feel, see what I see. Barzog felt a cold, revolting, as if touched by dead flesh shudder run down his spine, making the skin under his coarse leather shirt prickle with fine, sharp goosebumps. He looked at his own hands, held out before him mighty, covered with a network of white, long-healed scars and yellow, old calluses. The hands of a warrior who had never known fear in the face of honest, certain death in battle. But now he was to face something immeasurably greater than simple death with eternity, an eternity that threatened not to kill him, but to consume him, erase his personality, his self, his memory, as the wind over lawn years erases footprints on sand, leaving only a smooth, faceless surface. You will become stronger than you had ever been, continued Animus, and its voice now sounded not from without but directly within Barzog's consciousness, in its very depths, as if reading his most secret, still unformed thoughts and fears. Far stronger and more powerful, we shall be like to great, full-flowing rivers merging into a single, irresistible, all-crushing torrent. Your physical strength will increase manyfold, your tribe, your clan will gain power over lands they dared not even dream of, over entire kingdoms. But the price, in the voice sounding in his head appeared the same inexorable heaviness. The price will be your freedom. The price will be yourself, who you were. Around them, in time with these words, the shadows on the walls wavered, swirled, weaving into strange, frightening patterns. And for a moment, Barzog thought, as if through a dream or deaf vision, that he heard distant, familiar, native voices, the hoarse, strained cries of his loyal warriors waiting outside, the dull, impatient roar of wargs, the mournful, lonely whisper of the steppe wind wandering the hollow and carrying the scent of wormwood. All that constituted the meaning of his life, all its simple, cruel fabric, all of it now hung by a thin, ringing thread, ready to snap, to crumble to dust in one instant, in one whir. He closed his eyes, trying to find within himself, in the depths of his weary soul, some answer, an echo of the former, blind, beast-like certainty of a chieftain and warrior. But he found only a gaping, black emptiness and the cold, indifferent, patient waiting of eternity itself, which was here, nearby, in this being. The choice is yours, son of the steppe, sounded Animus's voice again, now from outside, and in its even, lifeless tones Barzog caught, or imagined he caught, faint, barely perceptible notes of something distantly resembling emotion, perhaps cold curiosity at the subject's reaction, perhaps slight impatience. Accept me and we shall change this world, remake it to our will, make it as we desire. Refuse and your people, your flesh and blood, will vanish into oblivion along with all others who failed to adapt, to understand, to rise to the coming great changes. They will become fertilizer for a new era. Without even understanding they have died. Barzog slowly, with effort, as if lifting an impossible weight, exhaled. His hot, living, moisture-tense breath mingled with the cold, dead, motionless air of the cave. And this mingling seemed to him a symbol of all that was happening. He looked again at his hands that had spilled rivers of others and his own blood, that had broken bones and hewn flesh, but hands that now could bring into this world something greater than just death and destruction, something new, order, strength, his strength, and in the deepest part of his soul, amidst the chaos of primordial fears, the instinct for self-preservation, and the flood of contradictory doubts, slowly but inexorably, like the sun rising, a firm, unyielding, battering ram-like resolve was born. The resolve of a warrior seeing before him the only path, even if it led into an abyss. The resolve of a chieftain choosing for his people not wretched survival, but a chance at greatness, even if bought at a terrible price. I agree, spoke the orc. His voice sounded quietly, without its former power, but clearly, without a tremor. He nodded once, shortly, feeling as if the stone, shimmering floor was giving way beneath his feet, plunging into an abyss, though his feet still stood firmly upon it. But the world around was already beginning to change. When the words of agreement, fateful and final, escaped his lips, the ringing, fragile silence of the cave was torn asunder like rotten, decayed fabric under the onslaught of a sudden hurricane. The air, until then still and stifling, heavy as lead, suddenly streamed, wavered, and the outlines of Animus swam, distorted as if seen through air quivering over the flame of a giant, all-consuming fire. From the ancient, motionless being separated a smoky, translucent, yet dense substance. It crept slowly and inexorably, with a quiet, horrifying purposefulness, toward Barzog, like thick, dark, living resin oozing from age-old, bloody fissures in the rock itself. It did not merely move, it flowed, writhing, alive and directed, and from it smelled of ozone after a close, blinding thunderstorm, and ancient, untouched, pristine stone, the dust of forgotten, sealed crypts, and the freezing, absolute cold of interstellar void where there is no sound, no warmth. The first sensation was warmth, but not the kind that warms by a hearth, gentle and life-giving, but a dense, womb-like, almost damp, clinging heat smelling of the dust of forgotten tombs, the decay of millennia, and the dry rot of something infinitely old. It enveloped the orc in a dense, invisible yet palpable cocoon, penetrated under the skin, into the very depths of muscles, into the very structure of bones, filled his lungs with heavy, sweetish glowing and nauseating air that made him want to retch. Barzog felt his body, accustomed to sharp pain from wounds and bruises, respond to this deep alien invasion not with a cry, but with a deep, internal, uncontrollable trembling, convulsive, painful spasms rolling in waves from his spine to his limbs. Then, suddenly, without transition, this suffocating warmth was replaced by a piercing, bone-chilling cold, a cold that froze not the body, but the very soul, which locked his jaw in an iron grip and made his teeth chatter, while icy, sharp goosebumps ran down his back under his sweaty shirt. In this sharp, tortuous, rending contrast, in this insane alternation of fire and ice, his body began to change from within, to break and rebuild. Bones with a dull, repulsive crunch audible only to him lengthened. Joints creaked and cracked under invisible, monstrous pressure. Muscles swelled with an unfamiliar, alien, bursting from within, about to explode strength that made ligaments ache. Before his eyes, blurred by pain and a strange, heavy, stupor-like intoxication, swam dark, blurred circles, and the even, coldly glowing walls of the cave swayed, swam as if in feverish, delirious raving, losing all solidity, all reality. In his ears, over his own heavy, ragged, hoarse breathing, rose a growing, low-frequency, all-pervading hum, like the resonance of a distant yet mighty, rumbling earthquake born in the darkest, forbidden depths of the world. And soon, within this hum, this subterranean, ancient drone, began to emerge, like voices through the nose of a waterfall, fragments of alien thoughts, fragments of memories clearly not his own, images of alien lives, alien, long-vanished worlds and alien, long-lost epochs. The consciousness of animus, vast, ancient, cold and indifferent as eternity itself, began to fill his mind, slowly and methodically, with terrifying consistency displacing personal, dear, intimate memories, like a sea tide, inexorable and ruthless, washing away fragile, carefully built sand castles at the water's edge. The warm, achingly familiar image of his father's tent, smelling of hearth smoke, meat grease, and leather, mingled, distorted, and irretrievably dissolved in chaotic, blinding, deafening visions of primordial chaos from whose womb entire star systems were born and die. The face of a battle comrade, fallen long ago beside him in a cruel, filthy melee, with a death-pain distorted grimace for which he had sworn vengeance, blurred, faded, and disappeared forever, yielding place to the majestic, cold and indifferent, like eternal granite, visages of forgotten, mute gods gazing upon creation from the unattainable, icy height of their celestial thrones. External, visible and frightening changes followed the inner transmutation, as a shadow follows a body on a bright, cloudless noon. Muscles, already powerful, bulging under the skin, swelled unnaturally, increased in volume. Shoulders broadened, breaking familiar proportions, making his silhouette even more formidable. Titanic, transcending ordinary, Orcish measure, a creature from nightmares. And when the tortuous, seemingly endless process finally ended, Barzog's eyes, once always full of furious, living fire and unyielding, beastly will, went dead for an instant, becoming blind and empty. Then, from the very depths of the sockets, they flooded with an even, lifeless crimson light, cold, impersonal, and frighteningly calm, like distant, dying stars in the airless, soundless void of space. The new being, born of the fusion of two wills, one simple and furious, the other ancient and indifferent, slowly, with unfamiliar fluidity, turned. It moved toward the cave exit, and its gait was not merely heavy, echoing hollowly in the stone. It was inexorable, measured, devoid of all haste, and profoundly, to the bone, alien to all that lived, like the movement of an age-old, ponderous glacier crawling for centuries from snow-clad, silent peaks. It no longer emitted that blinding, crimson radiance that had illuminated the grotto at the moment of fusion, that the an invisible yet palpable field of ancient, titanic and absolutely indifferent power surrounding it was almost tangible. It pressed on consciousness, on the very desire to breathe, like an oppressive, heavy silence before the first, sky-rending lightning strike. It seemed the very emptiness of these places, its icy, mournful wind, its eternal silence and its mute despair had condensed, crystallized in this single, dark figure that had emerged from the stone womb into the dying, unsuspecting world, to stride across it with an all-crushing, barrier-ignoring step. When its titanic, distorted, unnaturally elongated shadow fell on the sandy threshold of the cave entrance, his band of loyal, battle-hardened warriors, awaiting their chieftain, froze in mute, blood-freezing stupor. They had seen with their own eyes Barzog, der Barzog, enter the black stone maw, vanishing into darkness. But what had emerged back was something else, alien, frightening to the depths of the soul, violating all natural laws. The air around the new being shimmered with a hot, wavering haze, distorting its already monstrous outlines, and from its figure, from its very presence, emanated the cold of the deepest, darkest strata of earth where sunlight never penetrated, and where no living foot had ever trod. A silence fell thick, heavy, pressing on the ears, as if the steppe itself around, all its grasses and stones, held its breath in anticipation of something inescapable, grand, and terrible. It lasted but a single instant, one short, arrested heartbeat, yet to each of the orcs it seemed an eternity spent on the edge of an abyss. And then, from the chest of the transformed chieftain, from the very chest that once gave forth battle cries, burst a sound unlike any they had heard before in all their cruel and nosy lives. It was not a cry of fury or a triumphant roar. It was a low, guttural, drawn-out call, born in the darkest, corrupted, remelted depths of what had once been a soul, and it was primordial, blind, unrestricted force and triumphant, reckless, all-consuming power, as if it issued not from the throat of a mortal creature, but from the very throat of the steppe, from the ancient, untouched, sleeping depths that remembered the birth of the world and now had awakened. The sound rolled in a low, threatening, living echo through the stone labyrinths of the cave behind him, making ancient, age-old dust tremble and sift from the vaults. It burst into the world, spreading over the silent and frozen in waiting plains. For an instant, the warriors stood stunned, struck to their very core by this all-crushing, overwhelming strength that now emanated from their chieftain, filling the space. Then, as if on command, from 50 parched with fear and amazement throats burst an answer hoarse, furious, wild, merging into a single, powerful, deafening voice. But now in their cry, in this roar, was heard not merely blind fury or habitual readiness for battle. And it was heard a frantic, almost religious, ecstatic exultation. They looked at the crimson, unblinking light in his eyes, at his titanic, changed, alien stature, at that almost tangible aura of ancient, dispassionate power emanating from him, and saw not an orc, not merely their chieftain, but the embodiment of their darkest, most secret, beastly faith, the birth of a new god, a god of destruction, strength, and might, come to lead them to great, unthinkable victory, or, which was no less honorable, to great and glorious demise. It was a wild, discordant, dissonant psalm, glorifying crude, simple force, the force capable of shattering the old, decrepit, rotten world and erecting a new one upon its still smoldering, warm wreckage. And in this chorus of pure fury and blind, unquestioning devotion, under the cold, indifferent, expressionless steppe sky, in that moment something new and terrifying was being born, not merely an orc clan, not a tribe, but a living, breathing, furious weapon, a weapon of an alien, ancient, merciless will that had just broken free from its stone, age-old prison. When the last echoes of exultation, this collective ecstasy, dissolved in the boundless, all-absorbing expanse of the steppe, the titanic, dark figure of the chieftain slowly, with the same icy fluidity, raised a hand. The gesture was brief, devoid of any emotion, and yet full of undivided, absolute, brooking no argument, authority, an authority that silenced even the eternally noisy, free steppe wind. As if quieted in respectful fear, "We return," sounded the order, and his voice was not like a voice, but like an underground, muffled drone born in the darkest depths of mountain rock. Before they tremble and gape in a great earthquake, they rode back across the steppes, and the long, grotesquely stretched shadow from the chieftain's figure, astride his huge warg, fell on the scorched earth in an oblique, dark stripe like a scar. The beast beneath him, usually so fierce and unruly, now stepped cautiously, almost stealthily, with tail tucked, as if afraid to disturb or displease the one who now sat upon its back, whose weight was different, not merely physical, but a weight pressing on consciousness by the very fact of presence. No one spoke a word. Even the most ardent, reckless, and talkative warriors kept an oppressive, heavy silence, feeling in their guts the inescapable weight of that inexplicable, monstrous thing that had happened in the stone womb of the cave. They rode behind their chieftain, keeping a respectful distance, but deep within, in their most secret thoughts, each vaguely yet inescapably understood they were led no longer by Barzog of the Black Spear, not the chieftain they had known. They were led by something ancient, indifferent, and profoundly alien, whose true aims and plans were shrouded in the darkness of bygone ages, and were incomprehensible to simple warriors. When the band finally approached the familiar stone hollow where their ash hide camp lay, the first thing that struck them even on approach was the unfamiliar, unnatural, dead silence. Usually, the camp hummed like a disturbed, noisy hive by evening with shouts, arguments, warg snarls, the clatter of tools. But now, in the pre-sunset hour, the orcs stood silent, lined up at the entrance to the hollow in a motionless, mute formation. Their faces, lit by the setting rays, were tense and unhealthily pale under layers of grime. They had already seen how the wargs of the band walked not with their usual loose, predatory gait, but with an unnatural, frightening, mechanical submissiveness. The shaman stepped forward from the crowd, slowly, as if each movement cost him a great sacrifice. His figure, withered and stooped, seemed even more fragile against the backdrop of the chieftain's titanic shadow. A bony, trembling hand, shaking with mute rage and ancient fear, gripped a staff so tightly that the finger joints whitened and the skin stretched taut over bluish veins. When Barzog dismounted from his warg, his movements were fluid, precise, and unnaturally quiet, like a large predator stepping on damp leaves. The elder, gathering all his will, all his faith, resolutely, without hesitation, barred his path, becoming a living barrier between the clan and what had returned. The shaman's eyes, deep sunken in their sockets, burned with a gloomy, consuming fire of righteous anger, but in their very depth, behind this flame, could be read genuine, animal, primordial fear not for his own life, but before something that violated the very foundations of the world, a deep evil emanating from the very essence of his being, from that part of the soul that remembers the smell of primordial chaos. The spirits of the steppe whisper to me. Barzog, his voice, usually low and measured, broke into a hoarse, wrenching, desperate cry, full of genuine, terror, the terror of a seer seeing the end. They do not whisper, they scream. Of defilement, they howl of desecration. That which has returned to us from the stone womb is not you. In this shell there is no trace of your spirit. You have brought into our home, to our hearths, a black shadow, an abomination against the will of the ancestors. They turn away from us, from you. I hear their weeping in the wind. He raised his staff high over his head, and the dried skull of a steppe eagle atop it hung still, staring with empty eye sockets into the chieftain's crimson eyes. Bone amulets, made of teeth and claws, jingled thinly and mournfully, as if lamenting in mortal anguish and already consummated doom. I, keeper of the covenants, voice of the spirits and ancestors, forbid you to cross this threshold, roared the old man, and in his words was all the power of millennia-old tradition. Renounce it, renounce this foreign spirit, before it is too late, before the ancestors turn from us forever and leave us alone with the darkness. The air around them froze, became thick, viscous and heavy to breathe, as if saturated with lead dust. The entire clan, holding its breath, froze in absolute silence, staring at the chieftain, in whose immobile, dark figure each now with horror discerned something inescapable, inexorable, and profoundly alien. He did not change expression. Not a muscle twitched on his darkened, smooth as polished obsidian face. He slowly, almost with lazy, sated indifference, stretched out a hand not toward the shaman himself, not to push him away, but toward his trembling, raised staff, this ancient symbol of authority, knowledge, and connection. Spirits, came the same metallic, subterranean drone the warriors had heard on the steppe, a sound devoid of the timbre of a living throat. In its even, cold tone was neither a flash of anger nor a hint of mockery, only the absolute, all-consuming indifference of eternity to an insect squealing at its feet. Those spirits you hear, old man, the voice slightly drew out the words, letting them fall like stones, are but the whisper of sand on the wind, empty echo, possessing neither strength nor meaning. Their time is ended. It ended the moment I crossed the cave's threshold. Henceforth, this clan will heed only one voice, a single one, mine. His fingers, strong and cold as metal, closed on the staff's shaft just below the shaman's hand. There was a quiet, dry rustling sound, as if sand were pouring. Then a clear, dry, distinct crack, like the sound of a large bone breaking under weight. The carved, weather-worn staff, symbol of the shaman's connection with ancestral spirits. Snapped into with the ease of a rotten dry twig, offering not the slightest resistance. The fragments, now stripped of all power and magic, fell to the dusty, trampled earth with a dull, ignominious, mundane sound. The shaman recoiled as if struck in the very heart, the very soul. His face, covered in a web of wrinkles, twisted in a grimace not so much of physical pain as of inexpressible, profound, paralyzing horror before sacrilege, before how easily and simply the sacred had been destroyed. He whispered something soundless, his lips moving, staring not at the chieftain, but at the pathetic fragments of his staff, but words, spells, or curses stuck in his parched, fear-clenched throat, unable to escape, unable to change anything. Barzog did not hesitate. His movement, after that moment of immobility, was swift, sharp, and lethally precise, like the strike of a cobra that has already chosen its target. He did not reach for the weapon on his back. His right hand, the very one that had just broken the staff, shot forward in a short, hard jerk and closed on the withered, thin throat of the shaman. The crack of cartilage sounded deafeningly loud in the absolute silence that had fallen over the camp, cuttingly clear against the background of utter muteness. The elder convulsed in that iron, inexorable grip, his legs, tearing from the ground, thrashed helplessly, convulsively in the air, then hung limp, like rag dolls bereft of will. The chieftain held him thus for one more long, unbearable moment, gazing into the dimming, life's last sparks fading eyes. In those eyes, where but a second ago, the fire of faith and anger had burned, he saw the last understanding, the last connection with the world of spirits just declared non-existent, die out. Then he unclenched his fingers with the same calm, methodical indifference with which he had taken the staff, and the shaman's body, bereft of support, collapsed at his feet, a heavy, shapeless sack of bones. Barzog swept his gaze over the stunned, paralyzed by icy fear tried. His crimson, bottomless, light-reflecting not eyes slowly, leisurely, with cold assessing thoroughness, slid over the pale, frozen in horror faces, searching for the slightest spark of resistance, a hint of anger, a readiness to challenge. He searched and found none, only shock and emptiness. No more shamans. His voice rang out. It was not a shout, but a statement, a sentence, simple, clear, and final, brooking no arguments, discussions, or interpretations. No more spirits. No more whispers of ancestors. Henceforth and forever, I shall be your shaman, your law, and your only God. I alone. He stood over the lifeless body of the shaman, and the crimson light of his eyes, like the reflections of a distant, slumbering volcano, slowly, imperiously slid over the faces of the orcs. The wind, always free, wild, and unruly in these steppe lands, seemed to still, to freeze at the very earth, not daring to stir his now heavy and motionless hair. Even the flames of the evening fires, usually dancing fiercely, crackling and throwing sheaves of sparks, now burnt evenly, low, and obediently, as if pressed down by an invisible, titanic weight emanating from the chieftain and hanging over the entire camp. This old man, he nudged the lifeless body lightly, with detached contempt, turning it over onto its back with the toe of his boot, clung to whispers, to shadows, to spirits that run like hairs from true, tangible strength. He spoke to the wind and listened to stones, seeking wisdom in them. But wind will not stop a raised blade, and stones will not feed a hungry tribe. He was blind, and he led you nowhere. In circles, prisoners of fear and empty rituals, he paused, heavy and deliberate, letting each grasp the full irrevocable weight and finality, not only of his words, but of the act just committed. He drove this understanding into their consciousness, as one drives a stake into the earth. I, however, shall give you not whispers, but a battle cry that will make the heavens tremble and enemies flee. Not empty promises of harvest or hunting luck, but iron, real, sharp iron, that will hew enemies and win victory. Not barren prayers into the void, but real, bloody, visible victory, which you will seize with your own hands. The strength that now speaks through my lips and looks through my eyes is older and mightier than all his little gods combined. It is older than the oldest stars you see in the night sky, and deeper than the roots of the highest mountains you have met on your path. It does not ask or beg. It commands, and those who follow me, who submit, will be not slaves, but instruments of this will, and will command together with me. His voice did not rise, did not turn into a roar, remaining even, muffled, and monotonous. Yet each word, each syllable echoed in the very bones of the listeners, hammered there by hypnotic indisputable confidence against which there was no defense. Forget the old roads you walked before. Forget the old gods who gave you nothing but fear. From this day, from this very hour, we shall forge our own path, and it will be paved not with dust, but with bones. The bones of those who dare stand in our way, who dare deny our strength. We are the new law of this step, of this world, the first law, the only law, and the last. There shall be no other. He turned to face them all, and from him emanated such crushing, static might that it distorted all space around. Take that up, he nodded shortly, without emotion, at the shaman's body, and throw it to the scavengers. Let his bones, picked clean by vultures, bleach in the sun. Let them become the first warning and sign for any who dare speak of spirits, of ancestors, of old ways and false gods. From this day forth, such talk is death. No one moved at first, no one uttered a sound, not a whisper, but in their silence, in their frozen postures, there was no longer the former acute, terrorizing fear of the incomprehensible. It had been replaced by something else, a freezing, unconditional, full acceptance and submission. Acceptance of a new reality where doubt had no place. The old world with its shamans, spirits, covenants, and complex relations with the invisible had died here, on this dusty earth by a dying, silenced fire, with the crack of an old man's throat. A new, simple, and cruel world was born with a single, indifferent, cold, and all-powerful God who walked among them in the flesh of their own chieftain. He slowly, once more, swept his gaze over the frozen orcs, and it seemed his crimson eyes saw not their frightened, subdued, or loyal faces, but something else, inaccessible to simple mortals, the threads of destinies, possibilities, and doom, visible now only to him alone, like a pattern on cloth. We are leaving these lands, his voice sounded again, and the words fell one after another, minted and heavy as polished river boulders, leaving no room in the air for questions, objections, or even thought of them. Prepare. Break camp. We march before dawn. Their path henceforth lay to the south, into the endless, waterless steppes where, under the scorching sun, earth merged with sky in a quivering, deceptive haze of heat, forming a single, scorched, merciless mirage. The column, now more like a caravan of the entire tribe, stretched across the grass-crunching underfoot, leaving behind a wide, dead trail of trampled wormwood, bitter to smell, and the acrid, gray dust churned up by thousands of warg paws. This dust slowly settled on their backs, faces, ingrained itself into their skin, mixing with sweat, but now no one wiped it off with the indifference of the doomed. The orcs walked, not looking back at the abandoned settlement, at the pathetic remnants of wicker fences and post holes in their eyes, under overhanging, frowning brows, something new smolder and grew, not familiar, simple fury, nor blind, slavish obedience, but firm, almost fanatical, unshakable certainty in what was to come, for which it was worth leaving old places, ancestors' graves, and all the age-old, well-trodden paths. They marched toward something greater, and in this there was its own terrible meaning. Riders, mounted on the hardiest, swiftest, and meanest wargs, were dispatched to all corners of the steppe, like living sparks from a new fire. They carried the tidings into every remote gully, ravine, and valley where orc tribes still roamed, ignorant of each other. Tidings of the advent of a new, unseen, absolute strength, of a chieftain whose might surpassed that of any living being, who could break a shaman's staff with his bare hand, and in whose eyes burned the light of distant cataclysms, of one who called all to unite under a single, black as night banner, promising not peace, but war, a war that would overturn the world. These tidings flew faster than the swiftest steppe wind, reaching the most remote, lost settlements. There, by smoky, smoldering evening fires, sat old, gray-haired chieftains, their faces maps of past battles and losses. And there, too, young warriors who had not yet smelled real blood sharpened their crooked, serrated blades with dark, greedy fire in their eyes, dreaming secretly and openly of great battles, glory, and untold, easy loot that would fall into their hands. Some of the old chieftains, hearing these tidings from breathless riders, fell silent for a long time. Heavy, brooding, oppressive silence hung in their smoky tents, broken only by the crackling of fire. Their gaze, accustomed to gauging distance for a spear throw, turned somewhere into the distance, beyond the line of the familiar horizon, where already loomed, seemed, the shadow of coming, inescapable, great change. After agonizing, tormenting, lonely deliberations lasting sometimes whole nights. As they weighed on invisible scales loyalty to ancestors and a chance for their people, they gave the order, a quiet order, but firm, unwavering as good steel striking stone to break camp, to pull up stakes from settled, long-inhabited places, to abandon ancestors' graves and the entire habitual, age-honed way of life. They entrusted their fates and the fates of their warriors to this unknown, frightening power, leading their clans to the swelling, yeast-like, many thousand-strong horde that now sieged in the south. Old, scar-covered warriors who had seen more than one battle, for whom war was a craft, and young, hot-blooded orcs in whose eyes the wildfire of fury was only just kindling. All of them, as one, answered this call. They came, driven by vague hope for a better lot, animal instinct to follow the strongest, or simply an irresistible pull toward large-scale destruction. Tribes and clans joined without the usual honors and long rituals, without traditional challenges to single combat between chieftains, for the right to enter the alliance, without trials. There were no solemn, bloody oaths by ancient sacred stones, no exchange of weapons as a sign of trust, no nosy feasts lasting till dawn. Approaching the outskirts of the huge encampment, they simply flowed into the general, slowly moving column in silence, without unnecessary words, like small, muddy streams flowing into a great, dark, full-flowing river, taking up an assigned or simply found place in the common order. They looked over their new, alien brothers-in-arms with the habitual, distrustful squint, meeting the same wary, cold, assessing gazes. But when their eyes, almost against their will, turned to the massive, motionless, idol-like figure of the chieftain astride his titanic warg, in their eyes was read not only curiosity or fear. Read was a deep, almost instinctive, physical recognition of that inexplicable, hypnotic, absolute authority emanating from him in waves of cold and silence. They felt it with every cell of their weary bodies, heavy, ancient, and indifferent as time itself. And this sensation, this mute, all-encompassing pressure, was oath enough. No words, vows, or rituals were needed anymore. Silence and heaviness in the air were more eloquent than anything. But not all chieftains to whom the riders came met the tidings with readiness and submission. Proud, independent, and fierce, whose ancestors had for centuries roamed their own special, known to none and carefully concealed paths, and whose warriors had won meager glory and loot in countless, petty, cruel clashes with neighbors, answered the proposal of unification not with deliberations, but with immediate, furious, insulted refusal. In their eyes, narrow and piercing as honed knife blades, flashed not fear, but the fire of personal affront, wild rejection of the very thought of submission. Their hands, scar-covered, clenched the hafts of battle axes or spears so tightly that knuckles cracked, whitening under the skin, promising the riders not an answer but immediate, cruel reprisal for the very audacity. Some of the messengers sent to such unbending, willful, and cruel tribes disappeared in the boundless, merciless steppes, never returning to their new master. Their fate became part of the steppes' muteness, a silent warning of that old fury not yet broken. The chieftain received these tidings of lost messengers and subdued tribes with stony, soul-freezing indifference. This calm was more terrible than any furious outburst, any cry of rage, for in it was not a trace of animal reaction, only cold statement of fact, as if speaking of the wind. He sent no punitive detachments for immediate vengeance, demanded no detailed report from his scouts. His crimson gaze, devoid of the orc's usual living, changeable fire of fury or excitement, but for that no less, rather far more, piercing and all-seeing, was invariably, like a compass needle, directed forward, to the south, as if he saw through the fabric of time, through the thickness of distances and the veil of days, what was forever hidden. From the sight of simple mortals the end point, the goal, for which all was begun. Every lost life, every messenger not returned, every drop of blood spilled in vain was for him not tragedy, not cause for grief or vengeance. They were merely necessary, insignificant steps on the great, predestined path, petty, worthless coinade for a great, radiant, cruel future. And while he maintained his sepulchral, imperious silence, his horde meanwhile grew unrelentingly, unstoppably, like a snowball rolling down a mountain. It absorbed, attracted like a magnet, iron filings, all who were ready to cast off the past with its petty, stupid strife, customs, and fears, and follow the one in whose eyes burned the inexorable, cold fire of a new era, an era that promised the advent of great undying glory of conquerors of a new world, a history they themselves were about to rewrite. Thus they marched day after day, night after night, in an endless, exhausting rhythm, swelling their already numerous, motley ranks with ever new warriors, new, scrawny wargs, new, creaking carts laden with pitiful belongings. The column stretched for many miles, lost in the haze of the horizon ahead and behind. A slowly moving, endless, ugly city. A city of crude, untanned hide tents and garments, of dull, unpolished steel weapons, and moaning, snorting, howling from weariness and thirst wargs. By day the sun, merciless and blind, scorched the backs of their necks and shoulders, making sweat stream in rivulets over old scar tissue, washing away road grime, and dripping from sunburned, wine-roughened chins in salty, burning, eye-stinging streams. At night, when cold descended on the steppe, they slept, huddled in tight, stinking piles for meager warmth, under countless, cold, indifferent stars that seemed as distant and indifferent to their fate as the immobile, crimson gaze of their own chieftain, who did not sleep but sat by his dead fire, staring into the dark. Only he knew the ultimate, secret goal of this long, solan body-sapping journey. Only he, astride his titanic warg whose fur now had a strange, unnatural metallic sheen, as if covered with a thin film of rust, saw the invisible path. He saw it not on the ground, but in the very air, in the direction of his inner compass, leading through boundless, monotonous, wearying expanses to something concrete and important. His silence, heavy and saturated, was more eloquent than any loud, fiery speeches, and his crimson, motionless, never-blinking gaze, always and unwaveringly fixed on one point in the south, served as the only, infallible, doubt-free compass for this entire many-thousand-strong, motley, noisy, and yet submissively mute horde. And then one morning, when the first rays of the sun, still pale, thin, and cold, had just begun to gild the eastern edge of the sky, tinting it pale pink, on the very edge of the horizon, in the quivering, heat-shimmering haze, outlines appeared, at first vague and blurred, like a mirage born of thirst, weariness, and trick of light. They seemed a deception, but with each hour, with each measure, weary, dusty step of the wargs, whose powerful, sunken sides heaved heavily to the rhythm of their ragged, hoarse breathing, they grew clearer and more distinct, emerging from the mirage like an image developing on old, time and weather-tarnished high. Those were not simply hills, not elevations, those were the Black Hills. They rose from the flat plain in dark, gloomy, shark-crested waves, like a petrified, suddenly frozen sea of some ancient, unthinkable catastrophe, whose memory and pain were stored only in the deep, wound-like fissures on their bare slopes. These slopes were steep, precipitous, and utterly bare, devoid of any vegetation, not a wretched blade of grass, not a stubborn, clinging thorn bush. Even from this distance, many miles away, it seemed they did not reflect sunlight but absorbed it greedily, proprietarily drinking its warmth, so that around them even at noon hung a constant, cool, bluish shadow, silent, oppressive, and sinister. The air here, as they approached, became different, drier, thinner, prickly in the nostrils, as if filled with finest glass dust, and in it wafted a barely perceptible yet persistent smell of ozone, as if after a distant, invisible beyond the horizon thunderstorm, and the smell of melted stone, sulfur, the smell of ancient, never-extinguished subterranean fire eternally smoldering in the deepest, darkest bowels of the earth. The hordes, seeing them for the first time, would freeze for an instant in formation, feeling in their chests a mix of superstitious fear and involuntary awe, a cold, slippery serpent at the very heart, that a single glance, furtively cast at the unshakable, broad, dark back of their chieftain, at his nape, hard and immobile as polished black basalt, forced them again, submissively and silently, swallowing a lump in their throats, to move forward, to where, under the shadow of these black, silent, all-seeing giants, their final fate was to be decided. Skirting these grim colossi, their path now lay through even more boundless, scorched steppes where the wind roamed free and lonely, driving before it tumbleweeds, dry, dead, and crackling, and raising clouds of acrid, reddish, fine dust. This dust smelled of wormwood, the bitterness of lost past and distant, unseen fires eternally smoldering somewhere beyond the edge of visible light, beyond the horizon. And so they march, until one day the vanguard, and then the entire endless column, halted at an edge, not a cliff, but the edge of a huge, gaping crater carved into the flat body of the step like a festering, separating, bloody wound. Its edges were blackened, as if from necrosis, from the pain of the place itself. This was the Iron Maw, a citadel of sorrow and mute, brutish power, gnawed, scraped, gouged out in the very heart of those same black hills. The crater's edges were pitted, eroded, and collapsed, crumbling downward in stony tears and landslides, and at the bottom, in eternal, slowly swirling clouds of acrid, reddish from more dust that settled in the lungs with a metallic, bloody aftertaste, swarmed, like maggots in a wound, hundreds of creatures, orcs, green, gray, brown, all the colors of dirt, with cloaks covered in thick, multi-layered crust of dust, soot, and old, congealed blood clotted into a coarse, inseparable from fabric scab. They scurried back and forth, hunched, to the hoarse, meaningless, straining cries of overseers whose voices grated and squealed like unlubricated, rusty wheels on stone. Beside them, like living, lumpy, and gamely boulders, moved ogres, children of the great void and brute force. Their titanic bodies, the color of thick blood, gleamed under the crimson, smoke-haze sun with a greasy, shiny, filthy sweat, and their small, pig-like, deep-set eyes, dull and indifferent, surveyed the hellish landscape around them without interest, as if at a habitual, boring, daily scene not worth even a moment's notice. To the measured, dismal, never-ceasing clang of picks and blunt shovels biting into stubborn stone with a dry, abrupt crack, they mined iron ore. They wrenched it from dark, sinuous veins that snaked along the crater walls like fossilized, black veins of some old, dead and buried god. Deep below, in the very depths, gaped black, like devouring mouths at shafts descending into damp, impenetrable darkness. From there came a hollow, measured, funereal drum-like thud, as if the beating of a titanic, sick, weary heart, and blew a musty, heavy air smelling of damp stone, mold, sweat, and ancient, primordial, clinging fear that hung there undispersed, an eternal fog, permeating everything. Along crude, shaky embankments, hastily cobbled from rotten logs coated with slippery, oily mud, and earth packed by thousands of feet, creaked carts. They rattled on broken, crooked wheels, pulled by emaciated, rib-protruding wargs, and bore the mine rock to primitive, smoking smelters. The wargs themselves, once proud beasts, were now but shadows of themselves with eyes burning with a dull, yellow light, full of mute, hopeless hatred for all things living. They pulled their burden with silent and furious contempt, emanating a thick, bestial stench of digested rotten meat and unwashed, scab-covered hide, from which even fat, green, insolent flies kept their distance. Smoke from the smelters rose to the sky not in thin streams, but in black, greasy, heavy columns. They were viscous as tar, spreading in a dirty, poisonous stain across the faded, soot-bleached turquoise sky, veiling the sun in a reddish, sickly haze. The ground underfoot at the very edge of the precipice where they emerged was not earth, but a viscous, squelching, disgusting mire of mud, ash, coal dust, and, it seemed, congealed blood earth in which long ago no hint of life remained, not a single worm, not a single root, only dust, decay, and iron cold, soulless, and eternal. And at the center of all this chaos, this Babylonian pandemonium of torment, rose an ugly, shapeless, tumor-like mound of waste rock and slag. From its summit overseers, hoarse and angry, with rasping, guttural cries more like curses, issued their commands, operating this infernal mechanism. This was a place of hard, continuous, senseless labor, save for the extraction, a place saturated through with sour sweat, others and one's own blood, and the ringing, piercing, unceasing clang of iron, a place where in torment and filth, in fire and soot, war itself was being born and tempered dull, all-consuming, meaningless, and the only possible one, a war capable of swallowing in its hunger the whole world, grinding it into this same, squelching under boots, thick and barren mire. The chieftain halted his warg at the very edge of this precipice, on the last stone before the descent into hell began. His crimson gaze, heavy, attentive, and devoid of any surprise, slowly, methodically slid over the crater's floor. He absorbed, analyzed every detail of this industrial, man-made nightmare. Each hammer blow on glowing metal, each suppressed groan from the depths of a shaft, each curve of the greasy, black smoke column crawling into the sky. His horde stood behind, crowded into a dense, silent, pressing upon each other throng, and even the fiercest, most seasoned warriors, whose hearts over years of pillage and killing had blackened like coal, frozen mute, superstitious stupor, before their eyes unfolded a spectacle of power, but power directed not at life, not at creation, but only at destruction, at extraction, at endless, cyclical self-torment. The air here was thick and heavy as water in a stagnant, rotting swamp, filled with the taste of iron that coated the tongue like a metallic film, and of ash that crunched on teeth like sand. And each breath, deep and involuntary, seared the lungs from within as if with tiny, red-hot coals, leaving an aftertaste of death among the creatures swarming below, whose hunched, weary backs and swarthy, sweat and ingrained grime-covered bodies merged from afar into a single, teeming, faceless mass. Still stood out several figures. They stood apart on a small stone ledge, like an observation platform over the entire process. Their armor, though covered in the same ubiquitous, ray-red dust, was trimmed with dark, tarnished by time and soot, yet still sturdy metal, and they themselves stood with that air of habitual, undisputed authority given not by title, but by the right of the strong, the long-ingrained, bone-deep fear they inspired in all around. These were the chieftains of the local clans, masters of the Iron Maw. They observed the works from above, immobile and attentive, like shepherds with a cold gaze watching a stubborn, stupid, but necessary herd. One of them, standing out even among them for his massiveness, with gray, deep scars crossing his weathered mug like dried-up beds of ancient, waterless rivers, and a wide iron circlet grown, embedded into his lumpy, low forehead, raised his heavy head. His narrow, piercing eyes, like slits in old, dented armor, met the crimson, burning gaze of the uninvited guest standing on the edge of their world. And for an instant, brief as a spark when flint strikes steel, in those eyes, accustomed to cruelty and power, flashed something like instant, unmistakable recognition. Not fear, not panic, but a deep, underlying, instinctive understanding that the hour of choice had come. That very moment when fate brings the cold blade of a knife to the very throat and pauses, watching if the hand gripping that hilt will flinch. The uninvited guest simply stood at the very edge of the abyss, looking down into the ant-hill seething pit, and his silence, thick, heavy, and saturated, was more eloquent and terrible than any furious cries, threats, or warlike gestures. The orcs in the crater, first individually the keenest or most anxious, then, in whole groups, began to notice him. Their work, this meaningless, yours honed to automaticism bustle, slowed, stumbled. Individual pick blows became rarer. Carts halted on the embankments. Even the ogres, these dull, obedient, almost tool-like giants, ceased their measured, rhythmic, dull digging. They straightened in their hunched backs and stared up at the stranger from below with their small, tick-like, deep-set eyes. In those eyes, usually empty, barely glimmered a faint spark of primitive curiosity mixed with instinctive, animal wariness, before something large and incomprehensible. The Iron Maw, this giant, man-made, breathing crater full of fire, acrid sweat, and ringing metal, held its breath. Thousands of eyes from the gleaming, intelligent, predatory pupils of orc overseers, to the dull, pus and weariness-swollen sockets of goblins stared at the single, solitary figure on the edge of their world. They felt with their skin, their guts, the ancient, cold, indifferent power emanating from it, like the heavy, measured breathing of a sleeping but ready to awaken dragon. In this silent, tense confrontation, in this ringing, taut as a bowstring muteness, the fate of not only this place, this hole in the earth, was being decided. The fate of all that was inseparably connected with it, every blade forged in its hellish furnaces, every drop of blood spilled in its damp, dark mines, every short, cruel, meaningless life that had begun and was inevitably to end in this dusty, iron captivity. Feeling upon himself the heavy, unbearable burden of expectation of thousands of his warriors, the local chieftain, overcoming invisible resistance, raised his mighty, armored in war, cracked leather pauldron's hand. The gesture was simple, devoid of any theatricality or pathos, but imperious and brooking no argument. At his silent signal, the last, rare, uncertain blows of picks, the last clang of a shovel on stone ceased utterly. They were replaced by an absolute, oppressive silence, broken only by the distant, furious crackling of smelters where fire rested from the bowels and tamed raged, and the heavy, snorting like bellows breathing of ogres. The dust raised by thousands of bare and crude-booted feet slowly, lazily, almost reluctantly began to settle, revealing a view of this underground kingdom in all its gloomy, ugly, and repellent beauty. Labyrinths of black shafts, heaps of empty, gray rock, remnants of mutilated, long-dead trees, and smoke. Eternal, greasy, black smoke, shrouding everything and drifting into the sky. The orc with the iron circlet, whose name once, in bygone times, had brought mute terror to surrounding valleys and petty tribes, took several unhurried, heavy steps forward. His leather boots, soaked in animal fat for suppleness and covered in a thick layer of dry, stone-like mud, thudded dully and measuredly on the stony, dead earth. He climbed up steps roughly hewn into the rock, worn by feet, leading to the very edge of the crater, to the place where the stranger stood. And now he stood face to face with him, separated only by a platform littered with gravel and debris. The distance between them was no more than a spear throw. But in that moment it seemed an entire, unbridgeable chasm divided them, a chasm between the old world, the world of survival, petty clashes over resources and iron rusting useless in the ground, and the new, whose icy, alien breath he now felt on the skin of his face, on his weathered cheeks. "You come uninvited, stranger," his voice sounded. It was hoarse and rasping as a file, the result of years breathing acrid or dust, and thousands of throat-tearing command cries. "This is our land, dug by our hands, our iron, won by our sweat, our strength, forged here. Here we are born, war with each other, and die by our own laws, by the laws of forge and hammer, leaf." The crimson eyes of the newcomer chieftain, like two smoldering, unextinguished coals, slowly, without the slightest haste, slid over the stocky, mighty as an oak figure of the speaker, lingered on the iron circlet grown into the forehead, like a crown, assessed the old, gray, like clan history, scars, and in them was neither a flash of anger nor a shadow of contempt. For this simple strength only the cold, all-seeing, bottomless indifference of eternity, from which blood froze in the veins and ice clenched in the chest. He did not answer immediately, did not deem it necessary to waste breath on words that meant nothing to him, and were mere empty sound. His silence, his very immobile, titanic bulk, were more eloquent than any loud speeches or warlike shouts. He stood, absorbing this entire scene, the frozen hell of labor, the thousands frozen in mute expectation, the tense, oppressive silence broken only by the hiss and roar of smelters, and, in his muteness, lay already the entire verdict on the old world, its masters, and their wretched, cyclical existence. The local chieftain felt a chill run down his back under the coarse, sweaty leather armor, a light, slippery serpent of fear which he had long, it seemed, forgotten, suppressed in himself many winters ago. In his first battles, he saw before him not merely an orc, even a great, legendary warrior such he had met. He saw something ancient, something that had existed long before his clan appeared in these cursed mountains, something that remembered the very births of these same black hills, and had seen distant suns and alien worlds die, fading. His fingers, short and thick, strong from constant work with iron, gripped the familiar, worn haft of the battle axe hanging at his belt so tightly that knuckles, under the coarse, callous skin whitened. But in his soul, tempered in dozens of cruel, bloody clashes, ripened a firm, inexorable, hammer-blow-like understanding that any careless movement, any abrupt, threatening gesture on his part would be the last in his long, full of deprivation, pain, and blood life. This was not cowardice, but the calculation of a survivor faced with the force of nature. Wide, his voice broke through the habitual hoarse threat, and in it, to his own horror, sounded an echo of uncertainty and anxiety that settles in the heart when one realizes that all one's former victories, all one's battle-won glory is nothing, dust, and the enemy before one is not of the kind that can be slain with simple steel, cunning, or numbers. "Why have you come here? What do you want from us, from this pit?" And then the stranger finally spoke. His voice was low, deep, metallic, like the grinding of stone on stone in the very depths of mountains, born not by vocal cords, but by the very flesh of the earth, its ancient, mute, sleeping power, which he now personified. "I have not come for your iron," he said, and each word was minted, heavy and inexorable as an ingot. They fell into the tomb-like silence that had fallen like stones into a bottomless, dark well, and the echo of this fall spread to all corners of the crater, reaching the very bottom where eternal dark and fear reigned. "Ore is dust. Metal is dust. I have come for your strength, for the strength of all who dig this earth, who breathe its acrid dust and whose short, hard lives are woven into this stony firmament like veins in rock. He paused, short but palpable, letting his words penetrate the consciousness of the listeners, into their weary, routine cram, pain and hopelessness-filled souls. Like a honed blade slowly, inexorably entering a sheath, you dig iron for blades that blunt and break in the first serious clash, for armor that weathers and cracks under the blow of true, unbreakable force. You spend lives on what rusts in the earth or breaks in others' hands. I offer you to forge something greater, not weapons for petty, meaningless fights over a well, a female, or a piece of meat, but strength that will change the world itself, redraw its map to our liking. Strength that will make rivers flow backward and mountains bow their stony peaks before us. His crimson gaze, slow and all-encompassing, slid again over the frozen, statue-like figures in the crater, over the scarlet, insatiable fires of smelters, over the smoking, coal-devouring furnaces, over the darkest, dampest corners of shafts where age-old, animal fear lurked. Join me. The voice did not rise, but gained weight, and your hammers will beat not on lifeless ore, but in time with the heart of a new era. Your furnaces will sing not a monotonous song of labor, but a hymn that will make tremble and crumble to dust all thrones of men, all towers of haughty elves. Remain here, in this dusty, stinking pit, clinging to your rusty trinkets and your wretched way, and you will become a dust under the boots of those who dared to dream of more, who were not afraid to raise their gaze from the earth, from this filth, to the very stars and demand them for themselves. He fell silent again, and his silence hung in the heavy, poisoned air, inexorable and fine as a verdict carved on stone tablets of eternity. The choice was made, the offer not a request but an ultimatum was thrown at their dusty, wounded, weary feet. Now it was their turn, the turn of those who for decades, from generation to generation, were born and die in this God-forsaken and forgotten by all place, whose lives were measured not in years, but in the depth of dug shafts and the weight of extracted, useless ore, whose dreams, if they still had any, were filled not with light, but with the clang of iron, overseers' cries, and the heavy smell of fumes. The orc with the iron circlet stood immobile, and it seemed the very earth under his feet held its breath, frozen expectation of his decision. The air, thick with acrid smoke and poisonous fumes, suddenly seemed to him unbearably heavy, pressing on his shoulders as if all the long-accumulated weight of ore dug by him and his kin from the black depths had suddenly piled upon them. He felt upon himself thousands of gazes. In these gazes was read not simply mute expectation of an order. Read was a long forgotten, almost lost, trampled into the mud spark hope. The very hope he himself once, in distant youth, had buried under layers of ore dust. Bitter experience, and the merciless reality of this place. But together with this dangerous, blinding hope, in these same gazes lurked also fear. Clinging, cold, primordial fear of the unknown, of what this silent, dark stranger brought with him, whose eyes burned with the crimson light of distant, doom-bringing luminaries. He slowly shifted his gaze from the crimson, lifeless light-burning eyes of the chieftain to the frozen, mute sea of orcs in the crater. He saw these faces every day, year after year, in different light morning, evening, in sweat and dust, weary, haggard, embittered, resigned to their fate. They doubted because they knew no other life, could imagine nothing beyond these black walls. They fought neighbors or each other because otherwise they faced inevitable, wretched death from hunger or a knife in the back. But now, in their frozen, tense postures, in their slightly open, mute amazement-parched mouths, in their wide, full of unfamiliar tremor pupils, he saw something else. Not resignation, a mute, yet thunderous as thunder in silence question, the very question that now burned his own soul from within, consuming all confidence, all pride, all the weary wisdom of survival. His own life, long, cruel, and inglorious, passed before his mind's eye, swept by like smoke from a night fire borne by the wind and dissolving into darkness. Endless, petty, bloody clashes with neighboring clans for the right to dig in a slightly richer, slightly less stony vein. Fallen faces of kin, some from a stray arrow in the neck during a raid, others from a sudden, muffled cave-in in a dark, damp shaft where they were never dug out. The taste of tough, almost raw, blood-smelling meat after a rare, joyless, unrelieving victory. And everywhere, always, in every day, in every dream iron, they dug it in the sweat of their brow, melted it in hellish heat, forged it day and night until hands went numb from weariness. It was their blessing, the meaning of existence, and their eternal, unbearable curse. It gave strength of weapons, strength for trade, strength for defense. But this strength was limited, confined, imprisoned within the walls of this cursed, smoky, cramped ravine, this pit. Beyond its bounds lay a huge, unfamiliar, frightening, and, as he had always believed, deeply hostile world to which they had no path. The stranger's voice sounded in his memory again, as if from afar, through the nose of blood in his ears, yet with striking, cutting clarity. Thus under the feet of those who dared to dream of more. The local chieftain drew a deep breath, with effort, as if for the first time in many years. His coarse, wrinkle and scar-creased nostrils flared, taking in the familiar, age-old air of the Iron Maw. He smelled the scent of red-hot metal, the acrid, sweetish fumes from smelters, to familiar, like the smell of his own ingrained sweat and congealed blood on his hands. But in this moment, in this turning, terrible moment, this habitual, native smell suddenly seemed to him the smell of a prison in which he had spent almost his entire life, seeing beyond its stony, soot-blackened walls nothing but dust, stone, and the same as himself, haggard suffering. He again, slowly, overcoming the weight of the decision made, raised his gaze and looked at the stranger, and this time he saw in him not only threats of violence or imminent death. He saw a door flung wide open, frightening and alluring, straight out of this smoky, hopeless hell. A door leading into that very world of which he once, long ago, in distant, almost forgotten youth, had allowed himself only vaguely and secretly, shamefully to dream by a solitary night fire, to dream of something more, before harsh, merciless reality forever shackled his mind and body in the strong, familiar chains of routine, duty, and mere survival. His fingers, still gripping the familiar, comfortable axe half to the point of pain, unclenched, slowly, almost reluctantly, with a creak of joints, as if parting with a part of himself, with flesh and bone, with the very brute force and simple truth that had served him for long years, as the only sure support and measure of all things. He took a step forward, not a challenge, not a threat, not a combat stance, but a movement toward, heavy, conscious, irreversible, like a step across an invisible yet palpable threshold, beyond which everything former ended. You speak of strength. His voice sounded quieter, without the former command hoarseness, but from this it acquired a new, steely, unshakable firmness born not of a flash of fury, but of deep, tormenting deliberation, the forging of a soul in the crucible of choice. But true strength demands sacrifice. Real strength we give to this earth, to this pit, our lives, drop by drop, day by day, year by year. What must we give to you? What price do you set for your new world? The crimson eyes of the chieftain stranger narrowed almost imperceptibly, and in their depths, in that bottomless void, seemed to run a quick reflection of distant, subterranean flame, a flash of something resembling interest or satisfaction. He saw not merely an orc asking a question. He saw the breaking of an old, established, petrified will, and the birth of a new, unsteady, yet already firm one. He saw the agonizing and simultaneously beautiful, from his point of view, process of clay transforming into something more. He saw the first, decisive, creaking turn of a key in a huge, rusty lock he intended to open, to release into freedom the slumbering, wild, unbridled might of these beings. You give your lives to the earth by crumbs, day by day, he answered, and his metallic, emotionless voice acquired a new shade of merciless, indisputable, final truth against which there were no arguments. I demand to give them whole, all at once. Not for that iron that lies dead weight in the earth and awaits being dug up only to be buried again, as a blade in someone's flesh, for iron of another kind, iron that will be forged not in furnaces, but in your own hearts, in your veins, in your will. You will cease to be diggers, slaves of stone. You will become smiths of a new destiny, your own, and the destiny of this entire world, which does not even suspect your existence. He paused, heavy and deliberate, letting his words, like acid or living water, seep into the very soul of each listener, like water slowly but surely seeping into ancient, invisible cracks in a granite cliff, to then, freezing, tear it apart from within, turning it into a pile of rubble. Sacrifice, he continued, and his words now sounded not as a proposal but as a statement of an already accomplished, inescapable fact, has already been made. It is your old life, all of it, from the first to the last breath in this dust. It is already ended. Standing here and listening to me, understanding me, you have already made your choice, consciously or not. All that remains is to take a step, just one step, out of the pit onto firm ground, out of slavery into the storm. The orc with the iron circlet stood, not moving, and every muscle of his body, every tendon was strained to trembling, to cramp, to unbearable pain of choice. The stranger's words hung in the poisoned air, heavy and inexorable as lead weights placed on the scales of his personal fate, and the fate of all his people. He heard behind him, in the crowd of his warriors, a restrained but growing, tide-like rumble, thousands of suppressed exclamations, an alarmed, fearfully hoping whisper like the rustle of dry, dead leaves before an advancing, all-sweeping storm. He felt how the ground, not the stony earth under his feet, but the very ground of his being, was giving way beneath him. Everything he believed in, lived by, for which he spilled his own and others' blood, for which he broke backs and souls, all of it, in one moment, under the gaze of those crimson eyes, turned to fine, useless dust that would now be caught and scattered by that very wind that eternally roamed over their cursed crater, fate. He rasped, and the word burned his throat from within like a red-hot coal, just taken from a furnace. We forged our fate here. In sweat, in blood, in filth. Every scar on the body is a reward for survival. Every fallen in the dark of a shaft or in a clash with a tribesman is the price we paid for the right to call this pit home. The crimson eyes of the chieftain did not flinch, did not avert their lifeless gaze. In them was neither a trace of sympathy nor condemnation for weakness, only cold, all-encompassing, surgically precise clarity, as if he saw through flesh, muscle, and bone, straight into the convolutions of the soul, into its most secret, dark and light corners, which the orc himself did not know within himself. You call reward the marks of chains. His voice rang out, and each syllable was honed, tempered, and polished like the blade of a newly forged, perfect blade. You take pride in the price paid for the right to breathe this acrid dust and die mute, nameless. You have built yourself a throne of rusty iron, filth, and bones, and you think that from this throne you rule the world, but your world is a pit, and your throne is but a pile of rubble that tomorrow, after the first storm, will be covered with sand and dust, and of it no trace will remain. He slowly, majestically, with cold dignity, walked his gaze over the frozen, stone statue-like figures of the other chieftains on the ledge, over the stunned, lost, inner struggle-filled faces of the orcs in the crater, over each one who listened, holding not only their breath but the very thought. You dug the earth, dug in search of strength, thought. Strength is in iron. You were mistaken. Strength is not in iron. Strength is in will, in that will that can make mountains tremble from its steps, and rivers reverse their flow. I do not offer you a new yoke, another master. I offer you to become an anvil against which the spears and crowns of the old, decrepit, blind gods will shatter like fragile glass. You have dug graves all your life. Excellent. It will come in handy. Now you will dig one large, common grave, for everything that was before this moment, for your fear, for your slavery, for your wretched, cramped, walled-in universe that you built for yourselves and in which you willingly languished. His voice did not rise, did not turn to a shout or roar. It remained even, muffled, subterranean. But each uttered phrase acquired an almost physical, pressing heaviness, impressing itself into consciousness like a giant hammer into red-hot, pliant metal, changing its shape forever. You fear to give your lives, but is not what you call life already a slow, agonizing death? Death in motion, death at rest, death in every breath of this cursed, acrid, poisonous dust. I have brought you not death. I have brought you birth. Birth in a fire you have never seen, in a strength you dared not even imagine in your boldest, most secret, most insane dreams. He took a step forward, a single, small step. But in the ringing, absolute, unbearable silence of the crater, this step sounded thunderously, seemingly capable of splitting the earth beneath him and collapsing the edges of the pit. Look at the one who stands before you. His hand, not rising, barely perceptibly indicated the orc with the circlet. Is he your chieftain? Or the last guard, the last sentinel at the gates of your own prison? A prison you yourselves guard, afraid someone will take your chains from you. He clings to his axe like a drowning man in a swamp clings to a straw. But will a straw save from a sea storm, from a hurricane? I am not a straw. I am the storm itself. And now you have a choice, to remain in your wretched, cramped, yet familiar shelter, where rust of time, oblivion, and uselessness will eat you away bit by bit, day by day, or to step outside, to meet this storm face to face, and become not its victim, but its part. Become the very storm, become the force that will determine its path, its fury, its goals. The orc with the iron circlet looked at him, unable to tear his gaze away, and his own reflection small, crumpled, dust-covered, scar-covered creature doubled and tripled in the crimson, bottomless, like wells. Eyes of the stranger, he saw himself from the outside, as never before, and he suddenly, with incredible, almost painful, humiliating clarity, realized all the ridiculous insignificance of his scars, his crude power, all his so-called victories over neighbors. It was a bitter, burning, humiliating revelation, but at the same time cleansing. It washed from the soul age-old, thick layers of dust, lies, self-deception, and habitual despair. Your hammers, continued the low voice, and it now sounded not only from without but somewhere deep within his own skull, in the darkest and lightest foundations of consciousness, in the place where instincts are born and decisions made, will strike not on lifeless, cold, or they will forge a new law, the law of true, indisputable strength, not that strength that only takes, destroys, and kills, but that which gives, creates a new reality in its own image and likeness. And the first blow of this hammer, the voice paused for an instant, and this pause was more eloquent than a scream, will be upon the fetters. Upon the fetters on your own hands and feet, upon those chains you yourselves once put on, were so long you grew into them, and ceased to notice them, considering them part of yourselves. The stranger paused, the last, the decisive one, and in the ensuing, absolute, ringing silence, where only the distant crackling of smelters and his own madly beating heart could be heard, it seemed one could hear how, along all seams, crumbled, fell to fine dust and was borne away by the wind the old, familiar, cramped, yet so familiar world, the world of the Iron Maw and all connected with it. The choice is simple, sounded the final verdict, to remain a shadow that will forever disappear with the first rays of a new sun, leaving behind nothing but a hole in the earth and a pile of slag, or to become those who will light this sun, who will determine how it will shine, upon whom, and for whom might will be. Your iron rusts in earth and air. Your will does not, until it is broken finally, until it surrenders. Show it to me. Show me that it still lives. The gaze of the chieftain seemed to burn not only the orc with the iron circlet, but each one standing below, penetrating through the thickness of weariness, filth, and despair, straight into the most secret, dark, forgotten corners of their souls, where under layers of habitual resignation and hopelessness, like embers under ash, still smoldered long forgotten, but not entirely extinguished sparks. Sparks of something greater, anger that could be not mere malice, but fury, a dream that could be not fantasy, but a goal, strength that could be not merely brute might but will. His voice, still so even, acquired a new all-pervading power. It now sounded not like the grinding of stone on stone, but like the hum of the earth itself, awakened from its age-old, heavy sleep and speaking in the language of pure, inexorable force, understandable on the level of instinct. You listen, it sounded, and words fell like drops of molten metal, but do not hear, look, but do not see. You think I speak of conquests, of new pastures for your scrawny wargs, or a patch of land for your filthy feet. He slowly, with icy, bottomless superiority, shook his head, and in this simple movement was an abyss of contempt for the very insignificance, pettiness of such wretched, earthly desires. I speak not of land, I speak of being, of ceasing to be creatures crawling in filth and content with crumbs, to become strength, the strength that will dictate laws to the very cosmos, remake it to its will. Your ancestors, his hand waved to the side, as if brushing away ghosts, fell prostrate before lightning and trembled before thunder. You will hold in your hands these very lightnings. Your descendants will not wake in a cold sweat from the howling of wind in gorges, or the roar of an alien beast beyond the wall. The wind will howl because they pass by. Beasts will fall silent, hearing their step. He raised a hand not in supplication, but in command. The gesture was sharp, imperious, and final, as if with one movement he had stopped time itself in the crater, freezing every speck of dust in the thick, poisoned air. This crater, his voice struck like a hammer. This pit, this wound in the earth is not your home. It is your cradle, and it is time, long past time, to step out of it. Time to cease being despised, downtrodden, forgotten by gods and the world tribes. Have you been humiliated? Good. Excellent. Preserve this anger. Absorb it into your bones, your flesh, your blood. Let it become fuel for your future furnaces, steel for your blades. Have you been feared? Feared for your savagery, your strength? Excellent. Cherish this fear. Cherish it in the hearts of your enemies. Let it gnaw them from within. But yourselves, the voice grew quieter, but for that only more terrible, yourselves you must cast it off. Cast it from your shoulders as one casts off a heavy, rain-soaked cloak after a long, weary journey. Fear is the lot of the weak, the lot of victims, and you. He paused, and thousands of eyes bored into him. Are you weak, you, who for years, from generation to generation, gnawed, scratched, clawed your wretched existence from the very stone, from deaf, mute rock? No, you are not weak. You have simply forgotten who you truly are. What blood flows in your veins? His crimson gaze, like molten, red-hot metal, found in the crowd the most embittered and hungry, ready for anything faces. They tell you, his voice acquired venomous, hissing notes, that you are filth under their polished boots. They whisper, insinuate to you and each other that you have no future, that your fate is to dig and die, leaving behind not even a name, not even a memory. And you, he drew out the word, and in it sounded not condemnation but cold regret. You believed this lie, the lie that those who themselves tremble at the sight of your shadow, who clutch their jewels in sweaty palms upon hearing your step, have instilled in you. They fear you, fear that wild, unbridled, primordial strength slumbering in you like a volcano under a thin crust of earth. And their fear, their animal, uncontrollable fear, that is the only truth in all their sweet, lying words. The voice of the chieftain swelled, not growing louder in the usual sense, but acquiring such density, such piercing, oppressive power that it seemed the eardrums were about to burst from this all-pervading, vibrating in bone sound. It filled all space, displacing even thought. I have not come here to lead slaves to slaughter, like cattle. It thundered. I have come to awaken giants, giants sleeping in each of you, bound by the chains of your own fear and disbelief. I have come to remind you of your blood, the blood of those for whom mountains were not a ceiling, but a footstool, for whom rivers were roads, not barriers. Look at your hands. He himself looked at his own, raising them, and thousands of eyes followed. These are not the hands of slaves, these are the hands of creators, hands that can not only dig graves, but raise fortresses, not only break, but build. And what you build now will last not your centuries, will outlive the very stars in this sky. He sharply lowered his hand, pointing a straight, rigid finger into the very midst of the enthralled, emotion-storm-filled horde, to where, but recently, wretched, senseless life had seeped, turned into routine suffering. Enough hiding. His cry was like a whiplash. Enough clinging to wretched, rotten crumbs thrown from the tables of those who consider themselves your masters. The world does not belong to them. It never belonged to them by right. It belongs to the strong, to those who have the will not to ask, but to take it. And this will. He lowered his voice to a terrible whisper, yet one audible at the very bottom of the crater. It is already in you. It always has been in you. It screams. It tears to get out. And it is cramped in these stone walls, in these narrow gorges of your consciousness. The silence that followed these words became not merely absence of sound. It became ringing, taut to the limit, like the string of a giant bow ready to send a fateful arrow. And in this ringing, living silence, low, like a distant, subterranean roll of thunder born in the very bowels, was heard at first a single, hoarse, choked growl, then another, louder, bolder, then a third, fourth. The throats of thousands of orcs, ogres, even goblins, clenched in convulsive spasm of unexpressed, accumulated over years, decades, centuries roar. A roar that could no longer, did not want, did not dare remain inside. It demanded an outlet, demanded to be born. Then give it freedom, roared the chieftain, and his words became that last, decisive, blinding spark thrown into the overfilled, ready to explode barrel of accumulated hatred, pain, and thirst. Give. Let them hear your roar beyond mountains, beyond seas, beyond forests. Let their stone walls crack from your very cry. Let their pampered children wake in tears at night, not yet knowing their future is already stolen by you. Show them, show me, show that you have not forgotten who you are. And then a slab of sound, living, crushing, blind and all-consuming, collapsed upon the crater. It did not begin, it collapsed. First it was a dull, rising from the very earth hum, as if the planet itself groaned from the awakened power on its surface. Then, without transition, it exploded into a deafening, primordial roar. A roar coming not from throats, but from the very depths of lungs, from the dark, forgotten, sealed corners of the soul where not even the sun peered. It rose from the throats of creatures who for decades had been silent, resigned, buried their dreams in the deepest shaft of their hearts. This was a roar not of mere agreement or approval. It was a roar of liberation, a roar of cast-off shackles, a roar of awakened, wild, barrier-ignoring will. Thousands, tens of thousands of throats merged into a single, all-crushing, deafening voice. In it, fury of decades mingled with exultation of anticipation, and accumulated, thick-as-tar hatred with new, blinding, cruel hope. This roar echoed the stranger, was his response, an oath of allegiance, tribute of recognition, wrested by force. The area in the crater trembled, quivered, and the rock walls seemed to crack along the seams from this sound, birthing right here, on the spot, a new, cruel, bloody era. It seemed the very air in the iron maw vibrated and hummed in unison, and the flames in the smelters, as if answering the call, leapt higher, more furious, responding to the awakened, burst forth's primordial fury. The orc with the iron circlet no longer gripped the axe haft. His hand hung along his body, fingers unclenched, and in his always piercing, hard-as steel eyes raged a real, invisible from outside storm. A storm of final confusion, ultimate realization, and nascent, all-consuming faith. He now saw not merely a mighty stranger, he saw the personification, the embodiment of that very absolute, indisputable strength of which he once, in distant, almost mythical youth, had allowed himself only vaguely and secretly to dream by a solitary night fire, looking at the stars, scarcely visible from the pit. An ancient instinct, older than all clan laws, feuds, and personal ambitions, pierced him through, burned out all that was superfluous. The instinct to follow true strength. Before such strength, all his past victories, all his former, seemingly unshakable might as master of the crater, paled, became dust, a child's play. And then he, not taking his gaze off the crimson, coal-burning eyes, slowly, with the creaking strain of muscles stretched to the limit, raised his battle axe. But not for threat or attack, with a thunderous, sweeping motion, in which was all his former fury and all his new, unconditional submission. He drove the axe blade into a fissure in the stone at his feet, left it there sticking out, like a grim, stern obelisk suddenly grown from the earth. This was not a gesture of a slave bowing his head. It was an act of recognition by a warrior choosing his commander, the one to whom he now entrusted his will and his steel. He inclined his head not in a low bow, but with a short, sharp, respectful nod, as one greets an equal or one who has just indisputably proven his right to lead. His horse, breaking through clenched two-pane teeth, woke out through the growing general din, addressing his horde, his former people, but he looked only at the stranger. All here. His cry was like a pure, ringing hammer blow on an anvil, birthing a sheaf of sparks in the dark. A new chieftain has come. This gesture, this mute act, was understood by all without words. It was clear to the grey chieftains of minor clans on the ledge, and to the last downtrodden, ragged goblin in the deepest shaft. One after another, with a roar in which doubt was no more, with victorious, exultant clang of steel on stone, they followed his example, not kneeling, not humiliation, but weapons driven into the earth, spears, axes, hammers, fists clenched in mute but terrible oath, raised to the smoke-stained, filthy sky hatchets and bloodied picks. This was not a plea for mercy or grace. It was an oath given not by words, but by steel and strength, a vow carved not on parchment, but in the very stone of this cursed place. A wave of this crude, mute, yet absolutely unconditional recognition rolled across the entire crater, from one edge to the other, sweeping over terraces, embankments, shaft mouths. They did not bow. They crossed over. Crossed under his command, bringing as gift not the obedience of slaves, but their fury, their loyalty, and their readiness to die and kill. The silence of the chieftain amidst this roar was more eloquent than any loud words or answering speeches. He did not move, stood immobile as a rock, accepting this spontaneous, furious, primordial oath as something due, predestined, self-evident. His crimson gaze slowly, imperiously, without haste, slid over the forest of axes driven into the earth, over fists clenched in mute fury, over the frozen, in feverish, furious expectation crater. He absorbed all of it, this awakened, crude might, this readiness for action, blind fury. And in his indifferent, cold eyes was read but one thing: cold, undivided, deep satisfaction. Was Smith, who has finally found suitable material for his work. The Iron Maw was no longer merely a place of penal labor and hopelessness. Henceforth it became a weapon forged and tempered by his ancient, inexorable will. Finally, when the roar began to subside, turning into a hollow, angry, impatient expectation, he took a step forward, to the very edge of the stone platform. It seemed the very darkness hanging in the shafts and fissures thickened around him, became part of his titanic, dark silhouette, a halo of authority. Enough digging, his voice sounded, and it was not a call, not a request, but a statement of fact, acquiring in his mouth the force of an indisputable, natural law. Take up your weapons. Those weapons you drove into the earth. You will need them, but not for digging. He swept his gaze over the frozen, yet boiling from within horror, and in his gaze was read a heavy, inexorable, like the movement of tectonic plates, resolve. Your hammers henceforth will strike not on lifeless ore, but on the helms of enemies, on the shields of those who dare call themselves your masters. Your iron will become not a tool, but the flesh of a new world, a world we shall forge on the wreckage of the old. And your roar. He made a barely perceptible yet weighty as lead pause. Your roar today was but the first hammer blow on the anvil of the future. Remember this day. Today you cease to be a pack of scavengers, rummaging in others' refuse and your own waste. From this day, from this minute, you are a pack of wolves. A hungry, angry, united pack. And we go hunting. A hunt that will have no end, until we are sated. The Iron Maw, this once gloomy, dismal, cyclical hell, transformed beyond recognition in a matter of days, but not toward order, cleanliness, or light. It transformed toward multiply, concentrated, directed chaos. Chaos that had acquired a sinister, single, all-consuming goal. Now it became a temporary yet formidable haven for tens of thousands of orcs, ogres, wargs, and other foulness. It seethed like a giant anthill, fused from crude high, dull steel, insane fury, and blind faith. The air, previously saturated only with limestone dust and acrid smoke, now buzzed with the deafening, unceasing hum of voices, the clang of weapons sharpened on stones, the dull, threatening growl of hungry, yet now no longer hopeless beasts. Each day along the surrounding trails, like blood through revived veins, streamed here new hundreds exiled by their kin, hungry, embittered at the whole world, attracted by wild, overgrown with unbelievable details rumors of a new strength, of a new god arisen, in the very heart of their cursed, forgotten lands. These tidings flew faster than the swiftest war, carrying with them the name Iron Shaman as he began to be called in weary, fear and hope-filled whispers and, in hoarse, rapturous cries, the chieftain whose gaze burns through the soul, and whose words reforged will as a hammer reforges iron. But before building plans for great conquests, before ranging this seething, sprawling anthill for a long stay, the Iron Shaman commanded otherwise. His order, short, minted, and allowing not the slightest argument, spread through the ranks, transmitted through clan leaders and overseers turned into his commanders. The order was met at first by uncomprehending, stunned, almost frightened silence. He ordered to dig, but not to expand the crater for new dwellings, not to dig new shafts for or to forge more weapons for the campaign. No, he ordered to drive a single shaft, deep, narrow, descending into the depths, into the very dark, primordial womb of the mountain, to where the stone was ancient, silent, and cold, where not even the foot of the most desperate or greedy miner had trod in all the long history of the Iron Maw. He ordered to dig downward, into the very heart of darkness, obeying the undiscussed, absolute will of the Iron Shaman, work in the depths of the mountain seethed with new, directed fury. Now this was not senseless or extraction, but a sacred rite performed at the god's command. Ogres, whose muscles were swollen with brute force and minds simple and obedient as draft animals, gnawed into the primordial stone with huge, jagged, jaw-like picks. In the sticky, stifling, dust-filled darkness, from each blow flew sheaves of blinding, short-lived sparks, momentarily illuminating their sweaty, concentrated mugs. Orcs, more skilled in the craft of shoring and tunneling, sat heavy. Time and moisture blackened timber props wrapped in rawhide, still smelling of blood, so the vaults of newly driven tunnels would not bury the diligent, tireless diggers alive. It seemed that in the stony, silent depths a giant, sleeping for centuries, heavy heart had awakened and begun to beat, and its beats dash reverberated in the very bones of those standing above, evoking a vague, superstitious tremor. The Iron Shaman did not often descend into the seething, sweat and fear-breathing darkness of the shaft. He stood at its very edge, on that same wine-beaten stone ledge where he had once accepted absolute, undivided power over the hordes. His crimson gaze, smoldering like an ember under a layer of ash from under his frowning, heavy brow, was turned downward, into the gaping, black maw of the tunnel. But he saw not the sweaty hunchbacks of orcs, not the hard, stubborn rock. He listened for something else, a barely perceptible yet insistent, continuous call that streamed through the thickness of sleeping stone, like the voice of kindred blood, like an echo of his own fragmented pulse. He sought shards of a fallen once, in a great and ancient battle, part of the element of animus his own, scattered, dispersed essence. He remembered its cold, merciless, all-pervading radiance, its creative and simultaneously annihilating power that had been wasted, shattered in that distant, titanic confrontation. Those few shards that survived and did not dissolve into chaos must lie here, in this special place, a place saturated with age-old metal, pain, heavy will, and mute fury, an ideal vessel for storing such strength. He felt there weighed by unrelenting summons, like a quiet, insistent, ringing hum in his own blood, in the very core of his being. This summons had led him here, to these black hills, to this iron maw. He did not trouble himself with explanations for the reasons of these strange, war-unrelated searches. His will, simple, direct, and indisputable as the blow of a heavy hammer on an anvil, was for the orcs the only law given from above, and the hordes dug, obeying blindly, not fully understanding the ultimate goal, but unquestioningly, fanatically believing that their new master, their God in flesh, led them to something great, unthinkable, to something that would forever eclipse all their former, wretched, dusty life, all pain and all hopelessness. They broke ever deeper, to the very dark, silent, ancient heart of the mountain, and each pick blow, each splintered piece of rock was in their eyes not merely movement of earth, but a step, measuring the path to the return of their master's lost might, to the acquisition of that final, all-crushing strength that would allow them, his instruments, to finally become that very storm of which he had spoken with cold fire in his eyes. Finally, after many days and sleepless nights marked only by the clang of iron on stone, the screech of a drag sled over gravel, and the heavy, hoarse, weary breathing in narrow, sweat and dust-smelling tunnels, happened what all, it seemed, had been waiting for, not knowing what exactly. The pick of one of the ogres, huge, jagged, rang out deafeningly, rebounding from something unyielding, absolutely solid. Neither the sharp, jagged edge of the blade nor the furious, invested blow left on the mysterious, dark surface the slightest scratch, not a hint of damage. News of the strange, indestructible find instantly, as if along a taut, ringing string, reached the surface, running up the chain from the very bottom to the top, and soon dozens of sinewy, rough leather strap-bound hands, with a straining roar, extracted the boulder from the dark womb of the shaft. It was not large, but incredibly, unnaturally heavy, as if forged not from substance, but from a clod of immobile darkness, dark and perfectly smooth, as if polished by an unknown, patient, and unfeeling hand over long millennia. It lay in the midst of a trampled clearing, and from it emanated such an ancient, lifeless, absolute cold that the air around seemed glaciated, and the breath of all standing nearby froze in their lungs in prickly, cutting frost. And this sepulchral, not of this world cold penetrated deep into the bones, making joints ache with a dull, senile, inexplicable pain. The stone, if it was a stone, seemed not to reflect light but to absorb it, greedily drawing it into its deaf, black, and bottomless core. Attempts to split it with the heaviest, double-headed picks ended only in deafening hum. The stone lay in the midst of the crater like a mute, arrogant, all-knowing challenge, surrounded by a tight, growing ring of perplexed, irritated, and now openly frightened orcs. Their habitual, boisterous, simple-minded cheer gave way to a burdensome, full of ill forebodings and superstitious horror silence. And then he came. The Iron Shaman descended into the crater, and the crowd parted before him instantly, silently, and hastily, as water parts before the steel, inexorable prow of a ship's bow. In his movement was the same inevitability and majesty as in the movement of an avalanche. Even the boldest orcs involuntarily lowered their eyes, unable to bear the cold grandeur of his step, that oppressive presence emanating from him. His crimson eyes, always only smoldering like embers under a layer of ash, flared with the brightest, almost unbearable to look at, unnatural fire. It seemed flame now erupted directly from the eye sockets, illuminating his immobile, steely, mask-like face with a sinister, pulsing in time with something internal radiance. Long, distorted, living shadows from his figure darted across the crater walls. In his gaze, fixed upon the boulder, was neither simple curiosity nor anticipated triumph or joy of discovery, only bottomless, indifferent recognition, cold and final, as if he had met something long and well known, a part of himself that had awaited him here, in this stony grave, from the very beginning of time. From the moment of its fall, he approached closely, and from his mighty, now armored in dark metal figure emanated such concentration of power, that the air around rang with invisible, oppressive tension. Slowly, almost tenderly, as if touching something fragile and precious, he laid both hands on the cold, absolutely unyielding surface of the black stone. His fingers did not clench into a fist, did not dig in with claws, they simply lay flat, palms down, as if absorbing the age-old, dead cold of the stone. And in that moment, the boulder shuddered. A light, almost imperceptible jolt, but it was there. And it was like the first, convulsive breath of a newborn, still blind world. A quiet, dry, nightmarish crack, like the sound of bones breaking somewhere deep within a giant, swept across the frozen, silent crater. From the very top of the boulder to its base ran a thin, spider-web-like fissure, and from it, gathering strength with each moment, poured forth a blinding crimson light. It resembled not the light of sun, fire, or lightning, but the dark pulsing blood of the planet itself, poisonous and ancient. The stone did not split in half, as many expected. It bloomed, like a monstrous stone bud. Petals of hard-ass tempered steel rock fell away one after another, with a dull, heavy thud falling to the earth, revealing what had been hidden in the depths for millennia. In this cup of unearthly metal, black, deeply matte, reflecting nothing, glimmered, as if living its own life, a crystal. It was the size of the shaman's own fist, and its light was not even and calm. It pulsed, now flaring into a furious, blinding crimson conflagration, now subsiding to a smoldering, threatening glow, like the beats of a giant, just awakened, sick heart. The rhythm of this light was older than the oldest mountains and seas, deeper than the very memory of the world, and this imperious, crimson rhythm resonated deep within each present, forcing their own hearts to beat in the imposed, alien cadence, evoking an ancient, primordial, animal tremor mixed with freezing horror and mute awe. For even the dullest among them understood, not with reason but with their guts. They had touched something infinitely older, more terrible and mighty than themselves, their clans, and all their history. The Iron Shaman stood, not taking his palms from the cold flesh of the split boulder, and his own internal, crimson radiance merged with the light of the crystal into a single, pulsing living whole. Over his steely skin, as if in response to this union, ran tiny, bluish lightning of recognition, kinship, reunion. On his face was not a trace of a smile or relief, only an immobile, concentrated mass, like the visage of a stone idol gazing upon eternity and seeing nothing but it. He gazed upon the found part of himself, and in his crimson gaze was read not the joy of recovery, but the cold and indifferent iron certainty of a master, the certainty of a smith who has finally found his lost main tool, without which all his previous work, all plans, were but childish preparatory play. In that moment, under the eternally smoke and ash-shrouded sky of the Iron Maw, the world shifted from its habitual, precarious place, creaking like a long unopened door in a forgotten, cursed sepulchre. The fragile, illusory balance of forces was broken finally and irrevocably, and the silence, heavy, deafening, that followed the birth of this crimson light, was louder, more terrible, and more significant than any battle cry, any thunder, and each who saw it understood. The first beat of this new, steely, merciless heart must inevitably, inescapably be war. War compared to which all their former clashes were a fight of puppies. The forging of the scepter became a matter not swift, requiring not merely brute force, but precise, unfailing, almost mystical knowledge. The Iron Shaman chose for this work a deep, hidden from prying eyes natural cave at the very base of the Black Hills. The air in it was thick and motionless, smelling of sulfur and red-hot iron, ozone, and something else, something inexpressibly ancient, metallic, and cold, the very smell of absolute power being smelted in the crucible of unbending will. He did not use the common, nosy smelters where deafening din stowed and hung acrid smoke mixed with the sweat and fumes of thousands of involuntary creatures. Instead, his Orcish weaponsmiths, the most skilled and tested, whose lives were not worth a broken coin, whose souls long ago were steeped in fire and fear. Under his unblinking, burning gaze built a personal, not high forge right on the stone floor of the cave. They fired it not with common charcoal giving even heat, but with special black, only to the touchstone's mine, in the deepest, airless shafts, where the very darkness seemed dense and viscous. The flame in the forge was not yellow or orange, as fire in an ordinary smithy. It was deep crimson, the color of congealed blood, the very that oozes from an old, unclean wound, and the heat emanating from it was a desiccating wave, burning moisture out of everything nearby. It melted not only iron but, it seemed, to very air, making it dense and prickly. From this air the throat tickled, and breathing ceased as from inhaling fine, red-hot dust, and tears stood in the eyes from the very unbearable dryness, as if the eye sockets themselves were turning into a desert. Each breath burned the nostrils, leaving on the tongue an aftertaste of ash and bitterness, as if here they smelted not metal, but the very memory of water, of coolness, of something living and soft that once existed beyond this stone womb, to blank for the half that same black, unearthly metal, cold to the touch even under the sun's rays, as if carved from a shard of eternal night, was placed into the very heart of this infernal heat. The shaman did not entrust the fine work to ogre smiths, whose calloused hands knew only brute force capable of bending an iron rod, but did not feel that hidden music of metal. He himself, removing his new armor and bearing mighty, ritual scar-laced arms, each of which was a history of pain and vow, took up a forging hammer, its haft dark from age-old sweat and having absorbed the despair of all who had held it before him. His blows were not furious and chaotic, but measured, precise, and inexorable, like the passage of time marking epochs. Each blow echoed in the cave's hollow silence with a pure, low ring, like a funeral bell, and with each new blow the shapeless mass slowly, obediently began to acquire outlines along, straight, perfectly balanced haft of the future scepter, in which already could be guessed its future lethal stateliness. The work went on day and night, in an endless, monotonous rhythm, knowing no weariness and doubt. The metal cooled, losing its crimson glow and again becoming black and lifeless, was again placed into the insatiable belly of the forge, and the shaman again took up his forging. His shadow danced bizarrely and menacingly on the cave walls, like a second, dark being repeating his movements. His very will, his cruel concentration, seemed hammered into the metal with each blow, making it stronger than tempered steel and heavier than lead, filling it with mute, ready to explode strength. When the haft was ready, having taken its final, stern form, it was the crystal's turn. It was placed in a specially forged setting for it. This was not a crown or a decorated cup, but rather stern vices of the same black, light-hating metal, whose smooth, unadorned jaws were to forever enclose the heart of the scepter. The red-hot setting was closed with a force capable of breaking a giant's bone. Around the pulsing crimson light heart of the scepter, the metal, cooling, forever fused with the crystal, becoming its inseparable part, its dark armor and continuation. In that very moment, when this fusion was completed, the crimson light of the crystal flared, not in a blinding conflagration, a concentratedly and menacingly, like the light of a torch caught in a lens and ready to burn everything in its path, gathered into a tight, obedient energy beam. The Iron Shaman slowly raised the finished scepter, feeling its perfect, lethal balance. When the center of gravity fell exactly under his fingers, the weight in his hand was not burdensome, but confident and kindred, as if this thing had always been an extension of his own will, his flesh and bone. Once lost and now returned, he clenched his fingers on the rough, now cooled surface of the haft, and the even, powerful pulse of the crystal responded with a low, familiar hum in his own blood, ending the long separation and heralding the beginning of a new, terrible unity. The scepter was ready. It was not a talisman or a pompous adornment for ceremonies, created to please the eye. It was an instrument of unlimited power, forged with the same ruthless efficiency with which his orcs forged their simple, murderous axes, where each element served but one purpose: death. The first, preparatory stage of the path was completed. Now this mute scepter, this conduit of will, was to be filled with living, terrifying strength. And this filling was to begin immediately. With the acquisition of the scepter began the great replanning of them all. And it was like blood beginning to run faster through veins. At the first command of awakened consciousness, what before had been a wild and unmanageable festering on the earth's body, a chaotic jumble of pits and dugouts, was to be turned into a honed dagger, polished to razor sharpness and aimed at the heart of the world. And the first thrust of this dagger, its first test, was to begin not with a campaign to distant lands, but with the remaking of the very abode, with bringing it into perfect, ruthless order, reflecting the new, steely will of its lord. The air, thick with ash and hot metal, filling the lungs with acrid, suffocating dust, now resounded with new sounds, not the former chaotic clang and wild cries, but measured, inexorable hammer blows nailing heavy iron plates into a single, monstrous hole. Ogres raised a wall high, crudely cobbled from iron, atop which rose a palisade of sharpened, spear-like logs whose ends were charred to coal-black. From afar, in the haze of smoke and air quivering from heat, the entire wall seemed the ribs of an immense, long-dead and decayed beast, whose giant carcass had stiffened and frozen in a bony skeleton around the very heart of darkness, hidden in the depths of the mound. In this wall, impregnable and gloomy, gaped massive, blackened gates. When they opened to release another horror, they creaked and howled on their heavy iron hinges like a wounded beast, and this sound, full of agony and fury, was heard far around. This enclosure was not merely protection from external threat, it marked the boundary beyond, which ended the familiar world with its unreliable sun and incomprehensible laws, and began the mud giant pen, a monstrous prison, whose womb-like, lightless interior was ready to give birth and spew forth into the world a new, unseen wave of doom. Inside this iron ring, under a sky forever veiled in smoke, seethed work resembling the movement of a swarming anthill, but subordinated to cruel logic, chaotic labyrinths of dugouts and wretched lean-tos, where orcs had previously huddled, were demolished, yielding place to strict, monstrous order, oppressive with its soulless geometry. Now their dwellings clung to the slopes of the ancient mount, like scabs on an unhelling one, crooked beams driven in at unnatural angles, covered with thick, poorly tanned hides, and from them emanated a heavy, cloying reek of grease, sweat, and old blood. Each day, at the entrances to these dwellings appeared trophies, hung with manic care, skulls with carved patterns, bundles of dried sinews and yellowed bones, meant to demonstrate the inhabitants' might and inspire terror in a guest. A special, strictly allotted place in this new citadel was given to cages. They began to be built in the very center of the hollow, at the foot of the blackened mount, where the earth was steeped in age-old defilement. Long, mercilessly straight rows one after another, resembling neatly plowed fields, where one sows not living grain but cold, barren despair destined to sprout only fear and death. Each cage was cobbled from thick and hewn logs, bound for strength with strips of rawhide that, drying under the smoldering sky, shrank like a noose, biting into the wood and emitting a quiet, crackling moan. And for the completion of this realm of sorrow, this meticulously built machine of suffering, was required an altar, to which a special, central role was allotted, not simply a stone, but the core of darkness, the point of concentration of all the pain of this place. The shaman ordered to deliver from the depths of the mound a huge slab, dark, cold, and rough. Ogres extracted it from the earth and erected it on a pedestal built of crude and hewn stone and bones whitened by time. And then the Iron Shaman proceeded to the final work. He approached the black mass in complete solitude, his scepter in hand pulsing with an even crimson light, casting reflections on the immobile surface of the stone. He touched the tip of the crystal to the very center of the slab. From the scepter's touch, as if from red-hot iron, deep channels themselves began to run over the rough surface, diverging from the center like rays of an ugly, crooked star, to converge in a round, carefully measured depression cup. Their purpose was monstrously simple and obvious, requiring neither explanations nor reflections. The altar was ready. The shaman stepped back a pace, and his mighty figure froze before the creation of his will. His voice, low and indifferent, devoid of any triumph, sounded in the ringing, weary silence, echoing throughout the entire hollow. It hungers, and its first meal will not be long in coming. He raised the scepter, and the crimson light of the crystal, flaring with new, blinding strength, illuminated the cages built by his will, the smoking smelters, and the black rough slab of the altar, merging all into a single, dreadful picture of the predestined future. The great harvest of souls had begun, and the first sickle was already raised for the blow. Thank you for your attention. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next part and chapter.